In a time when America was young and wild, one man learned how to turn oil into power. His name was John D. Rockefeller. Born in a small farmhouse in Richford, New York, he started with nothing but a notebook, discipline, and an unshakable belief in order. While others dreamed of striking oil, Rockefeller dreamed of controlling it. He was quiet, calculating, and devout, a businessman who saw numbers as prayers and profit as proof of purpose. In the chaos of the oil boom, he built Standard Oil, a company so vast it shaped the modern economy. Pipelines, refineries, railroads, all bent to his will. He didn't just sell oil, he built a system that made the world dependent on it. Competitors called him ruthless, historians called him a genius. To Rockefeller, it was simply business, efficiency, faith, and focus. He became the richest man who ever lived, but never lost his obsession with control, routine, and charity. Each morning he wrote his goals, counted his money, and gave away millions. He believed wealth was a gift from God, and stewardship was a duty. But behind the calm voice and Sunday school smile hid a relentless drive that changed the world. How did the bookkeeper's son become the first billionaire in history? And what price did he pay for building an empire that even governments feared? This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, the man who turned oil into the blood of capitalism. Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. The July evening lay thick and golden over Richford, New York, the last of summer's light pouring through the windows of a modest clapboard house. Inside, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, her face beaded with perspiration, clutched the bedposts as the midwife coaxed her through the final moments of labor. The year was 1839, and the child about to enter the world would one day cast a shadow longer than the tallest buildings in America. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, holding up the squalling infant. Eliza, exhausted but relieved, whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. The child's father, William Avery Rockefeller, was not present for the birth of his second son. Few in Richford would have been surprised by his absence. Devil Bill, as locals called him, was known to vanish for weeks or months at a time, leaving his growing family to manage as best they could. John Davison Rockefeller opened his eyes to a world of contradictions. His mother, devout and disciplined, believed in the virtues of frugality and Christian sacrifice. His father, charismatic but unreliable, traveled the countryside selling patent medicines and timber rights, sometimes representing himself as a deaf-mute or a specialist in cancer cures. Between these opposing forces, the boy would forge a character as complex as America itself. "Write down every penny," Eliza instructed her children, watching as young John carefully recorded his earliest financial transactions in a small blue ledger. "The Lord sees our accounts, just as He sees our hearts." The Rockefeller home in Richford, and later in Owego, was a place of intermittent prosperity and sudden want. When William returned from his travels, he might bring bags of candy and fine clothes for the children. When he left, the pantry would gradually empty, and Eliza would gather her brood, Lucy, John, William Jr., and the younger ones for lessons in economy. "Never tell anyone what you are thinking," William advised his sons during one of his visits, pressing coins into their small palms. "In business, the man with the most information wins." John absorbed these lessons silently. While other boys in Owego spent their free hours fishing or playing marbles, he was often seen walking through town with a determined expression, looking for opportunities. By age 10, he had begun raising turkeys, feeding them through the summer and fall, then selling them at a profit before Thanksgiving. The Erie Canal had transformed upstate New York by the 1840s, turning sleepy hamlets into bustling commercial centers. In Owego, young John watched canal boats laden with grain, timber, and manufactured goods making their way east and west. He observed how fortunes rose and fell with the seasons, how some men prospered while others failed. "I will never be poor," he confided to his brother William one night as they lay in the bed they shared. "I will make something of myself." In 1853, the family moved to Strongsville, Ohio, seeking better prospects in the growing Midwest. Cleveland, 30 miles to the north, was rapidly becoming a transportation hub where railroads met Lake Erie shipping routes. For the Rockefeller family, the move represented yet another fresh start. The Ohio that greeted them was a state in transition. Forests were giving way to farms, villages were becoming towns. The rail network was expanding, and the air was thick with possibility. For 14-year-old John, Cleveland represented not just a new home, but a doorway to the future. One autumn morning in Strongsville, John encountered a farmer struggling to move his harvest to market. The man's wagon had broken down, and he needed $50 to repair it and transport his crop before winter set in. "I have some savings," John told the farmer. "I could lend you the money, but I would expect something in return." "What do you want, boy?" the farmer asked, surprised at the directness of the slim, serious-faced youth before him. 7% interest, John replied without hesitation. "You can pay me back after you've sold your harvest." The farmer, desperate and impressed by the boy's businesslike manner, agreed. 6 weeks later, he returned with $53.50, the loan plus interest. As John carefully counted the money, a revelation took shape in his mind. Money could work while he slept. The $3.50 he had earned represented no physical labor, no hours spent in the fields or shops. It was the beginning of a lifelong fascination with the power of capital. In his small notebook, what he would later call Ledger A. John recorded the transaction with meticulous care. Loan to Mr. Henderson, $50. Returned with interest, $53.50. Profit, $3.50. "John keeps accounts like a bank clerk," Eliza told her neighbor with quiet pride, watching her son at the kitchen table, his narrow shoulders hunched over his ledger. "He knows where every penny goes." William Rockefeller's visits to his family in Ohio became increasingly infrequent. During one return, he found his second son had established a small lending business among local farmers. "You're charging interest," William observed, examining John's ledger. "Good. But are you charging enough? These men need the money more than you need their goodwill." "I charge what they can pay," John replied evenly. "That way they come back when they need more." William laughed, clapping his son on the shoulder. "You'll go far, Johnny. You've got your mother's head and a little of my blood in your veins." The winter of 1853 was harsh in northern Ohio. Snow piled in drifts against the Rockefeller home, and winds off Lake Erie cut through the heaviest coats. Inside, Eliza gathered her children around the wood stove each evening, reading from the Bible and teaching them hymns. John, now 14, sat slightly apart, dividing his attention between his mother's devotions and the small account book in his lap. "We must save for times of scarcity," Eliza reminded her children. "The ant stores food in summer for the winter months." For the Rockefeller children, these were not abstract lessons. They had seen how quickly comfort could turn to hardship when William departed with most of the family's ready cash. John had developed a particular talent for thrift, not the desperate economizing of the truly poor, but a calculated efficiency. He could make a pair of shoes last twice as long as his peers, could stretch a meal or a cord of wood beyond what seemed possible. The family moved to Cleveland proper in 1853, settling into a rented house near the growing commercial district. The city hummed with Activity Lake steamers arriving from Buffalo and Detroit, railroad cars transferring goods to warehouses, horse-drawn omnibuses carrying passengers along muddy streets. Gas lamps had begun to replace oil in the wealthier neighborhoods, casting a yellowish glow through the evening fog. John enrolled in Cleveland Central High School, where his mathematical abilities and serious demeanor set him apart from his classmates. He walked to school each day with his brother William, the two of them navigating streets crowded with drays, peddlers, and merchants. "Look at those warehouses," John would say, pointing to the solid brick buildings along the river. "Someday I'll have my name on one of them." In the evenings, after completing his studies, John attended services at the Erie Street Baptist Church, where Eliza had become a devoted member. The congregation was a mix of established Cleveland families and newcomers like the Rockefellers. The pastor, Reverend Samuel Dyer, preached a gospel of personal salvation and moral discipline that resonated with John's developing worldview. God has placed before us two paths. Reverend Dyer thundered from his pulpit. One leads to righteousness and eternal reward, the other to damnation. Choose wisely, my friends. John sat straight-backed in the pew, absorbing every word. The church taught that wealth was not inherently sinful. Indeed, prosperity could be a sign of divine favor, but that the wealthy had special obligations to use their resources wisely and charitably. Eliza reinforced these lessons at home, setting aside a portion of their limited income for the church and for neighbors in need. Giving is not just duty, she told her children. It is an investment in God's kingdom. By 15, John had secured his first proper job as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a small commission merchant firm near Cleveland's waterfront. The position paid 50 cents per day, a modest sum, but steady income that helped support the household during William's lengthening absences. On his first day, dressed in his best clothes and carrying a small lunch prepared by Eliza, John walked through Cleveland's business district with barely contained excitement. The offices of Hewitt & Tuttle occupied the second floor of a commercial building on Merwin Street. Inside, clerks bent over ledgers, the scratch of their pens mixing with the muffled sounds of wagons and voices from the street below. "You'll start by copying these invoices," Mr. Hewitt instructed, placing a stack of papers before the boy. "Every figure must be exact. In this business, a misplaced decimal can cost hundreds of dollars." John nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir." For 9 hours each day, John entered columns of numbers, recorded shipments of wheat and corn, and gradually learned the rhythms of Cleveland's commerce. He watched how credit was extended to some merchants but not others, how prices fluctuated with supply and demand, how information about distant markets traveled through letters and telegraph messages. In the evening, he walked home through streets lit by the last glow of sunset, mentally reviewing the day's transactions. At the dinner table, he shared observations with his family, his voice animated despite his natural reserve. The Wilkinsons received a shipment from Michigan today, 500 bushels at 42 cents per bushel. But Mr. Hewitt knew the price in Buffalo had dropped to 38 cents, so he advised them to sell quickly before the news reached Cleveland. Eliza listened with a mixture of pride and concern. "And was that honest, John, to profit from what others don't know?" John considered the question seriously. Mr. Hewitt didn't lie about the price. He simply knew more because he pays for telegraph reports. That's why people come to him for his knowledge. It was the same lesson his father had taught him. Information was power. But where William used that power for short-term gain, quick sales and quick departures, John was beginning to see the value of building lasting commercial relationships. The summer of 1854 brought change to the Rockefeller household. William returned briefly, bringing gifts and stories, but the family had grown accustomed to his absence. Lucy, the eldest, was preparing to marry. William Jr. had found work as a clerk in another Cleveland firm. The younger children, Mary Ann and the twins, Francis and Francis, were in school. John, now 15, had been promoted at Hewitt & Tuttle. His salary had increased to $25 a month, a significant sum that allowed him to contribute substantially to the family, while still setting aside 10% for church, and another portion for his growing personal investments. One warm evening, John took a rare break from his ledgers and walked along the Lake Erie shoreline. Cleveland was transforming before his eyes. New buildings rising, the harbor crowded with vessels, smoke from factories drifting across the water. In the distance, he could see the outline of a lighthouse, its beams sweeping across the darkening lake. He thought of his father, somewhere on the road with his patent medicines and smooth talk. He thought of his mother, waiting at home with her Bible and her careful accounts. Between these two influences, he had forged his own path, one that combined his father's market instincts with his mother's moral certainty. John reached into his pocket and felt the small notebook he carried everywhere. In it, he had recorded not just financial transactions but observations about people, prices, and opportunities. Knowledge was indeed power, and he was accumulating both steadily, methodically, day by day. As night fell over Lake Erie, John Davison Rockefeller turned back toward the lights of Cleveland. He walked with the measured pace that would become his trademark, unhurried but purposeful, each step carrying him closer to a future he was already calculating. Behind him, the water lapped against the shore in a timeless rhythm. Ahead, a new America was taking shape, and with it, the foundations of an empire yet to be built. The boy who had traded turkeys in Owego and loaned $50 at 7% was becoming the man who would reshape American business. But on that summer night in 1854, he was simply a young clerk walking home to his family, carrying in his pocket the careful records of a world he was learning to master, one penny at a time. Cleveland hung in the balance between day and night, the September sun melting into the horizon as shadows lengthened across the Cuyahoga River. A young man of 16, tall and lean with watchful eyes, walked with measured steps along Superior Street. John D. Rockefeller carried himself with a quiet dignity that belied his years, his simple, dark suit well-maintained but unremarkable among the merchants and clerks heading home for the evening. He paused before the brick facade of Hewitt & Tuttle, commission merchants whose offices overlooked the bustling flats where steamers and schooners plied their trade along the river. Tomorrow would mark his first day as an assistant bookkeeper. The position had come after weeks of determined searching, knocking on doors throughout Cleveland's commercial district with the same patient, methodical approach that characterized everything he did. 3 months without pay, he whispered to himself, rehearsing the terms he had accepted. Then $25 monthly. He nodded slightly, satisfied. Many would have balked at working without compensation, but John saw beyond immediate gain. He was purchasing something far more valuable than money: knowledge, position, opportunity. The air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, tannery runoff, and the distinctive odor of commerce, ink, paper, and the sweat of ambition. Cleveland in 1855 was a city transforming itself, wooden structures giving way to more permanent brick and stone, rail lines stitching the region together in an expanding web of steel and commerce. John turned from the building and continued toward his modest lodgings. From his pocket, he withdrew a small leather-bound book, what would become known as Ledger A, and ran his fingers across its cover. Inside, in meticulously formed script, lay an accounting of every cent that passed through his hands. This was no mere bookkeeping exercise. It was the foundation of his philosophy. The following morning found John at his desk before anyone else arrived, familiarizing himself with the ledgers and systems of Hewitt & Tuttle. When Mr. Hewitt appeared an hour later, he seemed surprised to find the young man already at work. "You're punctual, Mr. Rockefeller," he observed, hanging his hat on the rack. "I believe time is a valuable commodity, sir," John replied, his voice soft but clear. "One that, once spent, cannot be recovered." Hewitt nodded appreciatively. "Well said. Let me show you our system." The commission house dealt primarily in forwarding goods, arranging shipments, negotiating rates with railroads and shipping lines, extending credit where necessary. Every transaction generated paperwork, bills of lading, manifests, receipts, contracts. For many, the endless columns of figures represented tedium. For John, they told stories more revealing than any novel. By lunchtime, he had already noted 3 instances where freight calculations had been made in the railroad's favor rather than the merchants. He approached Mr. Hewitt's desk with calm precision. "Sir, I believe there are some discrepancies in the Cleveland and Pittsburgh rates from last quarter." Hewitt looked up, initially annoyed at the interruption, then curious. "What discrepancies?" John laid out the ledger, his long finger tracing down columns of numbers. "Here and here. According to the published rate sheets, we've been charged the higher winter rate during spring months." Hewitt studied the figures, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. "You studied the rate sheets already?" "I committed them to memory last night, sir." A slow smile spread across Hewitt's face. "It seems we've made a fortunate hire." Sunday morning found John at Erie Street Baptist Church, the modest frame building filled with the faithful of Cleveland. He sat straight-backed in the pew, listening intently as Reverend Handy spoke of stewardship and duty. When the collection plate passed, John placed a carefully counted sum upon it, precisely 10% of his previous week's earnings. Though he had yet to receive a formal salary from Hewitt and Tuttle, he had earned a small amount helping Mrs. Bedford with her accounts across the street from his lodgings. 15 cents had been dutifully recorded in Ledger A, and now 1.5 cents made its way into the church coffers. "I would never have tithed my first million if I had not tithed my first $1.50, he would often say in later years, but the principle was already fixed in his mind. Money was a trust, not merely a possession, and a portion belonged to purposes higher than himself. After the service, he walked slowly back toward his lodgings, deep in thought. Fellow parishioner Thomas Andrews fell into step beside him. "You're the new clerk at Hewitt and Tuttle, aren't you?" Andrews asked. "Assistant bookkeeper," John corrected gently, "though I hope to advance in time." "My brother Samuel works with chemicals," Andrews said conversationally, "always experimenting with something or other. Recently, he's been reading about the distillation of coal oil for lamps. Fascinating business." John nodded politely, filing the information away. He had read of the experiments replacing whale oil and camphene with kerosene, but it seemed distant from his immediate concerns. Still, he never dismissed any fragment of knowledge. Everything connected, eventually. The freight for such materials must be considerable, he observed, especially with the railroad rates changing seasonally. Andrews laughed. "Trust a bookkeeper to think of the freight costs first." John smiled slightly. "Everything has its cost. Understanding those costs is the beginning of wisdom in business." October brought a chill to the air and new responsibilities at Hewitt and Tuttle. John had proven himself adept not just at maintaining the books, but at spotting opportunities to reduce costs and improve efficiency. Mr. Tuttle, the more reserved of the partners, had begun seeking his opinion on matters of credit. "What do you make of the Miller application?" Tuttle asked one afternoon, sliding a sheaf of papers across the desk. John studied the documents carefully, his expression revealing nothing. "Their figures appear sound, but I notice their shipments have been irregular. I would suggest visiting their warehouse personally before extending the full amount." Tuttle raised an eyebrow. "That's unusually cautious for someone your age." "I believe in verification, sir," John replied, "particularly when extending credit during uncertain times." The Panic of 1857 was still 2 years away, but John had already developed an instinct for financial weather. Cleveland's rapid growth had created speculative bubbles in real estate and railroad stocks. Too many businesses operated on thin margins and excessive credit. He had watched customers come and go from Hewitt and Tuttle's offices, and he had formed his own private assessments of their characters and prospects. That evening, as was his custom, John recorded the day's expenses in Ledger A. Beside each entry, he made small notations about the value received. A simple meal at a local dining room was judged adequate, overpriced. A new nib for his pen was necessary, fair value. These were not merely accounting entries, but a developing philosophy of value. By early 1856, John had earned the trust of both partners. His 3 months of unpaid service had given way to his modest salary, and he had begun to use his Sundays not just for worship, but for deeper study. After church, he would often remain behind with a small group of men who gathered for Bible study and discussion of business principles through a moral lens. "Wealth is a stewardship," Reverend Handy often reminded them. "We are but caretakers of God's bounty." John took these lessons to heart, seeing no contradiction between the accumulation of wealth and spiritual devotion. Indeed, in his mind, the discipline required for one supported the other. His ledger-keeping extended beyond finances to personal habits. Hours slept, books read, conversations of significance. One evening in February, he was working late at the office when Isaac Hewitt returned unexpectedly, accompanied by a railroad executive from the Cleveland and Pittsburgh line. "Rockefeller good, you're still here," Hewitt said. "Mr. Harrington and I were discussing the spring shipping rates. Perhaps you could retrieve the figures from last year's second quarter." John didn't need to consult the books. Flour was 35 cents per barrel to Pittsburgh, 42 to Philadelphia. The differential for grain was 12 cents per £100, with a winter surcharge of 3 cents applied through April, despite the published cut-off in March. Harrington's eyebrows rose. "You keep all that in your head, young man?" "I find it useful to remember what I've learned, sir," John replied evenly. Hewitt smiled slightly. "Rockefeller has a remarkable memory for figures. It's saved us considerable sums already." After the railroad man departed, Hewitt lingered by John's desk. "That was well handled. Harrington doesn't need to know we're preparing to challenge some of their back charges." "I thought discretion would be appropriate, sir." Hewitt studied him thoughtfully. "You've been with us, 5 months now? I think we might consider an advancement in your position. Junior bookkeeper, perhaps, with a corresponding adjustment in compensation." "I would be grateful for the opportunity, sir." Later that night, John made a careful entry in his ledger, recording not just the promised increase in salary, but also the lesson: value created leads to value recognized. Patience rewards. Summer brought both opportunity and temptation. Cleveland's position between the coal fields of Pennsylvania and the hungry markets of the Midwest made it a hub of speculation. Men gathered in taverns and coffee houses, trading tips on land deals and railroad stocks. Fortunes were made and lost on whispers and promises. John observed all this from a distance, declining invitations to join such gatherings. He had developed a clear principle: avoid speculation, seek sound investment. The distinction was crucial to him. Speculation relied on chance and timing. Investment demanded knowledge and patience. "You could double that salary of yours with one good railroad play," suggested a clerk from a neighboring firm as they walked from their offices one evening. "Perhaps," John acknowledged, "or lose it entirely. You've got to take chances to get ahead in this world." John shook his head slightly. "I prefer certainties, however modest, to magnificent chances." This philosophy extended beyond his personal finances. At Hewitt and Tuttle, he had begun suggesting changes to their credit policies, advocating for shorter terms and more rigorous assessment of customers' businesses. Not all of his suggestions were adopted. He was, after all, still a junior employee, but his careful analyses were increasingly respected. In July, he spent his modest savings on a 10-week course at Folsom's Commercial College, attending evening sessions after work. The curriculum covered advanced bookkeeping, penmanship, banking procedures, and commercial law. While some of the material simply formalized what he had already learned through practice, the legal instruction proved invaluable. Professor Tuttle, no relation to his employer, noted his diligence. "Most students your age struggle to maintain attention after a full day's work," he observed one evening, as John remained after class to review a complex banking procedure. "I consider this an investment, sir," John replied. "Knowledge compounds like interest." By the fall of 1856, John had established himself as an indispensable part of Hewitt and Tuttle's operations. His ledgers were immaculate, his memory for customer details uncanny, and his judgment regarding credit increasingly trusted. But he had also begun to look beyond his current position, studying the broader commercial landscape of Cleveland with the same methodical attention he brought to his books. On Saturdays, when the office closed early, he would often walk along the river, observing the flow of goods. Coal barges from Pennsylvania, grain shipments from the Western Territories, manufactured goods from the East, all passing through Cleveland's docks and rail yards. He noted which commodities moved in all seasons and which were subject to fluctuation, which commanded premium prices and which suffered from oversupply. "Always watching, aren't you, Rockefeller?" called a dock worker one crisp October afternoon as John stood observing a coal shipment being unloaded. "Just taking an interest in the commerce of our city," he replied with a slight smile. "Commerce, huh? You mean money?" John considered this. Money is merely the measure of value exchanged. It's the exchange itself, what people need, what they'll pay for, that interests me. The man shook his head, laughing. "You talk like a book, young fellow." But John's observations were far from academic. He was forming theories about the fundamentals of business that would guide him throughout his life. Chief among these was the importance of necessity. Luxury goods might command high prices, but their markets fluctuated wildly. Necessities, fuel, food, basic transportation, these were the true foundations of commerce. As 1857 began, John's position at Hewitt and Tuttle had evolved further. Now fully responsible for the company's books, he had also begun handling negotiations with some of the smaller railroad lines, securing favorable rates through a combination of volume commitments and prompt payment guarantees. "You've saved us nearly 8% on the Michigan Southern contract," Tuttle noted with approval after one such negotiation. "How did you manage that?" "I studied their operations first," John explained. "They have empty cars returning east that could carry our clients' goods. I simply proposed a rate that would be better than nothing for them, yet advantageous for us." This approach, thorough research followed by calm negotiation, became his hallmark. He never raised his voice, never made threats, never revealed which terms were most important to him. Instead, he listened carefully and identified the point of mutual advantage. Outside of work, his life remained simple and disciplined. He continued his church attendance and Bible study, maintained his meticulous personal ledger, and avoided the vices that claimed many young men's salaries. His landlady often remarked that she had never had such a quiet, orderly tenant. One evening in March, as he was working late, he received an unexpected visitor. Samuel Andrews, brother of his church acquaintance Thomas, appeared at the office looking for shipping information. "Thomas suggested you might help me understand the costs of moving materials from Pennsylvania," Andrews explained. "I've been experimenting with coal oil refining, and I need to calculate my expenses properly." John invited him to sit and pulled out a sheet of paper. "What volumes are you considering, and from which regions specifically?" Andrews described his small operation, essentially a workshop where he was distilling kerosene from crude oil, a substance just beginning to be extracted in western Pennsylvania. The process was still experimental, the market uncertain, but the potential seemed significant. "Whale oil prices continue to rise," Andrews noted. "People need light, and kerosene burns cleaner than coal oil or camphene." John listened carefully, asking precise questions about production methods, yields, and potential markets. By the end of the conversation, he had filled 3 pages with calculations. "Based on current freight rates and your production costs," he concluded, "you could potentially deliver kerosene to Cleveland retailers at 30% below the price of whale oil, while still maintaining a 25% margin." Andrews stared at the figures, impressed. "You worked all that out in an hour?" "The principles are straightforward once you have the data," John replied modestly. "It's simply a matter of accounting for all costs and finding efficiencies." As Andrews left, he turned back. "You have a remarkable mind for business, Rockefeller. If I ever expand this operation, I might seek your advice again." John nodded politely. "I'd be happy to help. The oil business seems interesting." It was an understatement that concealed a flash of insight. Cleveland's position between the nascent oil fields of Pennsylvania and the markets of the Midwest and East suddenly appeared to him not just as a general commercial advantage, but as a specific opportunity. He made a mental note to learn more about this emerging industry. The Panic of 1857 struck in August, triggered by the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. Banks called in loans, businesses failed, and credit virtually disappeared overnight. Cleveland, like most American cities, felt the impact severely. Merchants who had seemed prosperous one week declared bankruptcy the next. At Hewitt and Tuttle, the crisis brought both challenges and opportunities. Many customers defaulted on their obligations, but the firm's relatively conservative credit policies, influenced in no small part by John's cautious assessments, limited the damage. More significantly, their cash reserves allowed them to continue operations when competitors could not. "Your insistence on prompt collection and cash reserves doesn't seem so overcautious now, does it?" Hewitt remarked grimly as they reviewed the ledgers in September. "Financial storms, like natural ones, give warning signs," John replied. "I simply noted the excessive speculation in railroad stocks and the overextension of credit to unsound enterprises." What he didn't say was how personally vindicated he felt. his own financial practices, saving at least 10% of his income beyond his tithe, avoiding debt, maintaining liquidity, had positioned him to weather the storm comfortably. While friends lost jobs or took severe pay cuts, his position remained secure. The panic also created opportunities for those with cash and courage. Properties and businesses were available at fractions of their previous values. John began quietly investing his modest savings in small, sound enterprises that had been caught in the liquidity crisis but remained fundamentally viable. These weren't speculations but calculated risks based on careful study. He would visit each business personally, review their books, assess their management, and determine their essential soundness before committing a single dollar. Though the sums involved were small, the discipline of the process was forming habits that would serve him well when the stakes became immeasurably higher. By 1859, as the worst effects of the panic began to recede, John had risen to become chief bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle. At 20 years of age, he had established a reputation throughout Cleveland's commercial district for exactitude, integrity, and uncommon business acumen. He had also continued his private education, devouring commercial journals, studying the emerging science of management, and paying particular attention to developments in the petroleum industry. The first commercial oil well had been drilled that year in Titusville, Pennsylvania, triggering what would soon become a rush. John followed these developments with quiet intensity. One evening, as he closed the office, Isaac Hewitt stopped by his desk. "Rockefeller, I've been meaning to speak with you about your future," he said. "You've outgrown your position here. Have you given thought to what comes next?" John closed his ledger carefully before responding. "I have been considering various possibilities, sir. Such as? I believe there may be opportunities in the produce commission business," John said carefully. "With appropriate capital and connections, one could establish a presence in that market." Hewitt nodded thoughtfully. "You'd need a partner, of course, someone with experience in the trade." "Yes, sir. I've given that consideration as well." What John didn't share was the full extent of his ambition. The produce business was indeed his next step, but only one step in a longer journey. He had been studying the oil refining business with increasing interest, seeing in it all the elements he valued: a necessity product, inefficient production methods ripe for improvement, and Cleveland's strategic position for distribution. "Well, when you're ready to make that move, I hope you'll allow me to introduce you to some potential partners," Hewitt offered. "Your talents shouldn't be confined to bookkeeping, however exceptional you are at it." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your confidence." Later that night, in the quiet of his room, John made an entry in Ledger A that went beyond his usual accounting of pennies spent and saved. Foundations laid. Skills acquired. Next chapter to commence with produce commission to build capital. Ultimate target: petroleum refining when sufficient resources accumulated. Cleveland's position ideal. Providence willing. He closed the book carefully, a faint smile on his lips. The 16-year-old boy who had walked Cleveland streets seeking his first position had become a young man with a vision, methodical, patient, and absolutely clear about his destination. The October evening settled over Cleveland with a chill that promised winter's approach. John D. Rockefeller stood at the window of his modest office, watching as lamplighters moved methodically down the street, bringing pools of golden illumination to the deepening twilight. At 26, his features had already acquired the thoughtful, measured quality that would mark them for decades to come. Sharp eyes that calculated, lips that rarely revealed their owner's thoughts. Behind him, Samuel Andrews cleared his throat. "The last shipment from Oil Creek arrived this afternoon, 300 barrels just as ordered." Rockefeller nodded without turning. "And the quality?" "Better than the last. More consistent." Andrews moved closer, his hands bearing the chemical stains of a refiner's trade. "We're getting 5 more gallons of kerosene per barrel than Johnson's operation across town." Only then did Rockefeller turn, the hint of a smile touching his features. 5 gallons. That's nearly 7 cents of additional profit on each barrel. On 300 barrels, he paused, the calculation already complete in his mind. $21. Not insignificant. Andrews smiled. The former whiskey distiller had brought the technical knowledge of distillation to their partnership, but he'd come to appreciate Rockefeller's numerical precision. The way the younger man could reduce a business to its essential figures, finding profit in fractions others overlooked. "We should acquire our own cooperage," Rockefeller said suddenly. "I've calculated we could save 8 cents per barrel if we manufactured them ourselves." "That's another investment, John. We're already extended with the new stills." "It's not an expense. It's efficiency." Rockefeller moved to his desk, opening a leather-bound ledger filled with immaculate figures. "In this business, Samuel, the difference between prosperity and ruin lies in pennies." The Civil War had transformed Cleveland, as it had transformed the fortunes of many. When Rockefeller had established Clark and Rockefeller with Maurice Clark in 1859, they'd started with $4,000 in capital and modest expectations as a produce commission house. Now, just 3 years later, the firm handled nearly $500,000 in annual trade. The Union's insatiable appetite for provisions had made many merchants wealthy, and the Cuyahoga River teemed with ships bringing grain, salt pork, and whiskey for distribution eastward. Yet Rockefeller approached these wartime profits with characteristic caution. One evening, as he walked home through Cleveland's increasingly prosperous streets, he passed the newly constructed mansion of a government contractor who'd made a fortune in uniform cloth. Gaslight spilled from tall windows, illuminating a party within champagne glasses raised, women in silk dresses, a quartet playing in the corner. Maurice Clark, walking alongside him, nodded toward the spectacle. "Thomas Miller. They say he's made 200,000 since the war began. Perhaps we should consider government contracts ourselves." Rockefeller's expression didn't change. "Mr. Miller builds his house on shifting sand." "Sand that pays handsomely," Clark chuckled. "For now," Rockefeller replied. "I prefer foundations that will weather peace as well as war." They continued in silence for a moment before Clark spoke again. "You're still thinking about that Andrews fellow and his oil refinery proposition, aren't you?" "I'm considering it," Rockefeller admitted. "Kerosene isn't a wartime commodity, Maurice. It's the future. Every home in America needs light. It's risky. Half those wildcat drillers in Pennsylvania go bust within a year." "The risk isn't in refining, it's in drilling," Rockefeller corrected him. "Let others gamble on finding oil. The real opportunity is in processing what's already found." As they parted ways, Rockefeller continued alone to his modest home, where his wife Laura waited. Unlike other successful merchants who had moved to increasingly elaborate residences, Rockefeller maintained the same simple dwelling, free from debt and ostentation. That night, as was his custom, he recorded every expenditure of the day in his personal ledger, down to the penny. The discipline had become sacred to him, a ritual that separated order from chaos. 1862 brought both continued wartime prosperity and a harsh lesson. Against his better judgment, Rockefeller had allowed himself to be drawn into speculating in wheat futures. The market had seemed favorable, the information reliable. Then prices had collapsed unexpectedly, costing him several $1,000s, money earned through months of disciplined trade. On the evening after settling these losses, Rockefeller sat alone in his office, a single lamp burning as he carefully wrote in his journal. "I have often thanked the Lord that he gave me the wisdom to close out that speculation before the losses mounted further. I have resolved never to gamble in this manner again." He closed the book deliberately. The wheat speculation had been a deviation from his principles, a moment of weakness. It would not happen again. In business, he would seek only those opportunities where calculation, not chance, determined outcomes. The lesson crystallized something within him, a philosophy taking shape. Control what could be controlled, eliminate variables. Reduce business to reliable mathematics, leave speculation to others. The offices of Andrews, Clark and Company opened in 1863 with a single refinery near Kingsbury Run. Samuel Andrews brought the technical expertise, how to properly distill crude oil into kerosene, naphtha, and lubricating oils. Maurice Clark and his brothers provided additional capital. John D. Rockefeller brought something less tangible, but ultimately more valuable, a merciless focus on efficiency. "This is where we're losing almost a cent per gallon," Rockefeller said one afternoon, pointing to a stack of empty barrels. "The cooperage costs are excessive." Andrews wiped oil-stained hands on his apron. "What do you propose?" "I found a barrel maker who'll supply at 14 cents less per barrel if we contract for all our needs. Beyond that, I'm negotiating with the railroad for a reduced rate if we guarantee them consistent volume." "The Lakeshore Line." "Both lines," Rockefeller replied. "The Atlantic and Great Western and the Lakeshore will ship more with whoever offers the better rate." Andrews smiled slightly. At 38, he was older than Rockefeller by more than a decade, but he'd come to respect the younger man's methodical approach. "You're squeezing pennies, while the Clarks and I worry about gallons." "The pennies are where the fortune lies, Samuel." Rockefeller gestured toward the refinery, where crude oil was being unloaded from barrels into the still. "Anyone can build a still and make kerosene. But who can make it for a half-cent less per gallon? That man will still be in business when the others have failed." By year's end, the company had expanded to 2 refineries. Rockefeller spent his days moving between them, examining every aspect of production, searching for inefficiencies. He insisted on recovering and selling the byproducts other refiners discarded as waste: lubricating oil, naphtha, paraffin. He initiated experiments to redesign the distillation process for continuous flow rather than batch processing. In the evenings, he would often work late, reviewing ledgers and production reports in the light of a kerosene lamp, a product of his own refinery. The oil business was chaotic, with prices swinging wildly as new wells came in or played out in the Pennsylvania fields. But amid this volatility, Rockefeller was building a business designed to profit regardless of crude prices. Efficiency was his hedge against uncertainty. The strained relationship between Rockefeller and the Clark brothers came to its crisis point in February 1865. The issue was growth. Rockefeller wished to plow profits back into expansion, while Maurice Clark and his brothers preferred to distribute earnings as dividends. "The time to expand is now," Rockefeller argued during a particularly tense partners meeting. "Every barrel we refine brings a profit. Why would we not increase our capacity?" "Because we have families to support," Maurice Clark countered. "Not everyone wishes to live as frugally as you do, John." The words hung in the air, weighted with implication. Rockefeller's austere lifestyle had become a point of friction. While others built homes befitting their growing wealth, he maintained his modest dwelling, free from mortgage debt. While others dined at Cleveland's finest establishments, he carried a packed lunch to work each day. "This isn't about my personal habits," Rockefeller replied evenly. "It's about the future of our enterprise." The deadlock continued for weeks, with neither side willing to yield. Finally, it was agreed the partnership would be dissolved, with ownership determined by auction between the parties. On the appointed day, Rockefeller arrived with financing arranged through carefully cultivated banking relationships, credit that would stretch him to his limits, but which he had calculated with characteristic precision. The auction began with Maurice Clark's bid of $500 above the firm's book value. Rockefeller countered immediately. Back and forth the bidding went, the amounts rising in increasingly large increments. At $72,000, Clark hesitated, studying Rockefeller's impassive face. $72,500, Rockefeller said quietly. Clark conferred briefly with his brothers, then shook his head. "The company is yours, John." Rockefeller nodded once, betraying no emotion. The sum represented an enormous commitment, far more than he had in liquid assets. But he had secured the necessary financing, leveraging every banking relationship he had cultivated through years of prudent business conduct. He had bet heavily, not on chance, but on his own ability to make the refineries more valuable through discipline and innovation. The next day, the sign outside the office read simply, "Rockefeller and Andrews." That evening, Rockefeller sat with Laura in their modest parlor. She was knitting while he reviewed the day's papers, the transaction that had placed him in sole control of what was now Cleveland's largest refinery. "Are you concerned about the debt?" she asked, her fingers continuing their steady work. Rockefeller looked up. "There's a difference between debt for consumption and debt for production. The first impoverishes, the second enriches if managed prudently." Laura smiled slightly. "And you've always been prudent." "In business matters, one must be." He set the papers aside. "I believe we've reached an important juncture, Laura. The oil business is still young, chaotic. Most who've entered it approach it as gamblers, but it needn't be so unpredictable. And you intend to bring order to it. I intend to apply the same principles that have served us well thus far. Efficiency, calculation, reinvestment. The mathematics are straightforward. If we can refine oil more efficiently than others, we will prosper regardless of market conditions." Laura set her knitting aside. "Maurice Clark once told me he believed you counted pennies because you feared poverty." Rockefeller's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps once, but I've come to see that attention to detail is not about fear. It's about clarity. When you understand precisely what something costs, what it returns, you can make decisions others cannot." Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, a gentle patter against the windows. The Civil War was drawing to its bloody conclusion. President Lincoln had just delivered his second inaugural address, speaking of binding the nation's wounds. In the oil regions of Pennsylvania, derricks continued to rise as new fortunes were made and lost daily. But in his Cleveland parlor, John D. Rockefeller had found a different path. Not the feverish gamble of the wildcat driller, but the steady accretion of advantage through discipline and method. The auction had been his largest financial commitment to date, stretching his resources to their limit. Yet even as he assumed this debt, he felt a curious sense of certainty. He had gained control of his destiny. "We'll need to acquire additional land along Kingsbury Run," he said after a moment. "The refinery must expand if we're to achieve the economies of scale I envision." Laura studied her husband's face in the lamplight, the same kerosene lamp that millions of American homes now depended on for illumination after dark. At 26, John already possessed a gravity that set him apart from other men his age. She had sometimes wondered if he allowed himself any simple pleasures beyond his work and his faith. But watching him now, she realized that for John, the elegant mathematics of business were themselves a form of pleasure, the satisfaction of creating order from chaos. "Then we shall expand," she said simply. Rockefeller nodded, his mind already calculating the costs, the financing, the timetables. Beyond their window, Cleveland was transforming from a mercantile outpost to an industrial center. And in the quiet of that rainy evening, with the Civil War's final chapters being written far to the south, John D. Rockefeller was laying the foundation for an empire built not on speculation or chance, but on the relentless pursuit of efficiency, one saved penny at a time. The gentle tapping of rain on the window was a metronome to John D. Rockefeller's thoughts as he sat at his desk. The morning light filtered through Cleveland's perpetual industrial haze, casting the room in a muted amber glow. Outside, horse-drawn carriages splashed through puddles along Superior Avenue, their passengers hunched against the drizzle beneath black umbrellas. Rockefeller's office was a temple of order. Every paper aligned at perfect right angles, his ink bottles arranged by frequency of use rather than size. The ledgers, his sacred texts, were stacked with mathematical precision. He ran his fingers over the leather-bound cover of the most recent one, feeling the embossed numbers of the year, 1870. $1 million, he said softly to himself, the words hanging in the coal-scented air. A foundation strong enough to bear the weight of what's to come. Henry Flagler sat across from him, impeccably dressed as always, his beard neatly trimmed, eyes sharp with calculation. Unlike the restless energy that animated most men of ambition, Flagler possessed a controlled intensity that Rockefeller found comforting. They were similar that way, still waters that ran unfathomably deep. "Standard Oil of Ohio," Flagler said, testing the name on his tongue. "It has a certain inevitability to it." Rockefeller allowed himself the faintest smile. Standard, the promise of consistency. No more exploding lamps. No more widows and orphans created by inferior kerosene. He paused, adding with quiet conviction, and no more wasteful competition driving us all into ruin. A knock at the door announced Stephen Harkness, older than both men, with silver threading through his beard and the confident posture of someone accustomed to wealth. The man who had provided the crucial capital walked in and hung his dripping coat on the stand. "Gentlemen," Harkness nodded, rubbing his hands together against the chill. "I trust we're ready to begin." William Rockefeller arrived moments later, John's younger brother and financial lieutenant. Where John was reserved and methodical, William possessed an easy charm and fluid grace in social situations. The brothers locked eyes momentarily, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come from their humble beginnings. 10%, William said after settling into his chair. "With our combined operations, we now control approximately 10% of America's refining capacity." "A modest beginning," John replied, his voice soft but firm, "but sufficient." What went unspoken in that room, though understood by all four men, was that they weren't building a company but an empire. One that would be constructed not through the cannon fire of conquest, but through the quiet warfare of rail rebates, economies of scale, and superior business intelligence. The freight yard hummed with activity as tank cars were coupled and uncoupled, the smell of crude oil hanging in the air like an invisible fog. Rockefeller walked alongside the Pennsylvania Railroad agent, their footsteps crunching on coal cinders as they inspected the new shipment. 60 carloads a day, Mr. Warden, Rockefeller said quietly. "That's what Standard Oil can guarantee, every day without fail." The railroad man's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's considerable volume, Mr. Rockefeller." "It is, and it deserves consideration." Rockefeller stopped walking and turned to face the man directly. "The mathematics are simple. We can guarantee you volume that no other refiner can match. In return, we require rates that reflect the efficiency of handling such volume. Rebates are a delicate matter." "Rebates are a practical matter," Rockefeller corrected gently. "And drawbacks, our commission on our competitors' shipments, are merely compensation for the stability we bring to your scheduling." The railroad agent studied Rockefeller's impassive face, searching for weakness and finding none. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a statement of new reality. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," the man finally said. Rockefeller nodded once. "Yes, of course. Though I should mention I've had similar conversations with representatives of the Erie and the New York Central. Transportation is the lifeblood of our business, Mr. Warden. We seek partners, not merely services." Later, walking back to his office, Rockefeller passed a cooper's shop, where men were hammering wooden staves into barrels. The rhythmic pounding followed him down the street, a percussive reminder of another cost he'd already begun to control. Standard's barrel factories saved nearly 10 cents per barrel, a small sum until multiplied by thousands. Small advantages, systematically accumulated and relentlessly exploited. This was the foundation of everything. The winter of 1872 brought more than snow to Cleveland. The news of the South Improvement Company scheme broke like a thunderclap across the oil regions. Rockefeller sat in his office, reading the latest dispatches from Pennsylvania, with the detached interest of a chess player watching an opponent's move unfold exactly as anticipated. Flagler paced by the window, his usual composure frayed. "The producers have shut down their wells in protest. They're calling it a conspiracy, an octopus, a monopoly," he reported, his voice tense. "Emotions run high," Rockefeller observed, setting down the paper. "Fear makes men irrational. They're burning you in effigy in Titusville." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps disdain, crossed Rockefeller's face. The arrangement was perfectly legal. The railroads need stability, the refiners need reasonable rates. The South Improvement Company would have provided both. "Would have," Flagler emphasized. "The public outrage has killed it. Congress is making noise about investigations." Rockefeller stood and walked to the window, watching snowflakes spiral down to join the gray slush of Cleveland streets. "The scheme may die," he said after a long moment, "but the principle remains sound." And more importantly, He turned back to Flagler, his eyes calm pools. The chaos this has created presents an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Cleveland has 26 refineries. Most are now caught in a vise. Crude supplies uncertain, banking credit constricting, the future unclear. They're frightened, Henry, and fear creates flexibility. 3 days later, Rockefeller began his methodical visits to his competitors' refineries. He came not as a conqueror, but as a savior, offering a lifeline to drowning men. The offices of Alexander, Schofield and Company smelled of anxious sweat despite the winter chill. Morris Alexander, a man who had once sneered at Rockefeller's religious devotion and temperance, now couldn't meet his eyes across the desk. "Your books tell the story clearly enough," Rockefeller said, closing the ledger he'd been examining. "You're operating at a loss of 13 cents per barrel. Your equipment is outdated. The recent disruptions have only accelerated the inevitable." "We've been in business for 12 years, Alexander protested weakly. "And you might continue for 12 more as part of Standard Oil. We're prepared to offer you a fair price." "Cash?" "Stock," Rockefeller countered. "In our company. Join us rather than fight us. Your knowledge is valuable. Your facilities can be improved." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "So I become your employee?" "My partner," Rockefeller corrected. "One of many. All working toward efficiency rather than mutual destruction." He leaned forward slightly. "Consider the alternative, Mr. Alexander. This is not a passing storm, but a permanent change in the weather." The scene repeated itself across Cleveland. Sometimes Rockefeller went personally, sometimes Flagler, sometimes William. The message was always the same: capitulate and join, or stand alone against the inevitable tide. Within weeks, 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries had succumbed. The Cleveland Massacre, critics would later call it. Rockefeller saw it differently. A necessary consolidation, the strong absorbing the weak, chaos yielding to order. In the dim light of his home study, Rockefeller knelt beside his bed as he did every night, the floorboards hard against his knees. The house was quiet, his wife Laura and the children long since asleep. Outside, the gaslights of Euclid Avenue cast pallid pools on the snow-covered lawns of Cleveland's emerging Millionaires' Row. "Lord," he whispered, "I thank thee for the opportunities thou hast granted me. Guide my hand in this great work. Show me the path of righteousness in all my dealings." He paused, the silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional creak of the house settling. "Many say what we do is wrong," he continued, his voice barely audible even to himself. "They do not understand that consolidation brings efficiency. That efficiency brings lower prices. That lower prices bring light to more homes." Another pause. "If I must bear their scorn to fulfill thy purpose, grant me the strength to endure it with humility." The next morning found Rockefeller meeting with his expanding circle of lieutenants in Standard Oil's boardroom. Maps covered one wall, detailed surveys of rail lines, competing refineries, oil fields, and shipping routes. Another wall held charts tracking the price of crude, kerosene, and the various byproducts they were learning to monetize. John Archbold, a recent addition through acquisition, was reporting on his latest intelligence gathering. Hathaway and Reed in Buffalo are considering an expansion. They secured a loan from First National for $50,000. Rockefeller nodded. "Their costs? Approximately $2.15 per barrel, according to our sources. Their rail rates are 20% higher than ours. And their capacity? 600 barrels daily." Rockefeller made a note in his small black book, the repository of intelligence that gave Standard its invisible advantage. Information was power, detailed information was dominance. Monitor their progress. If they commit to expansion, approach them before the new equipment is installed. Offer stock, not cash. He looked around the table. "What news from the export markets?" Flagler straightened in his chair. "Our agents in London report increased confidence in Standard-branded kerosene. The consistency of our product is winning contracts. The British no longer trust the independent shippers, too much variance in quality." The name Standard was well chosen, William Rockefeller added with a smile. John nodded slightly. Quality and price, these are the twin pillars. We must excel at both simultaneously. He turned to another associate. The barrel factory report? The meeting continued for hours, each department reporting with precision, each report followed by Rockefeller's quiet, incisive questions. No detail was too small for his attention. A half-cent savings in barrel production, a quarter-penny reduction in transportation costs, microscopic advantages that, at standard scale, translated to substantial sums. The rumble of tank cars being coupled echoed across the rail yard as Rockefeller walked alongside Oliver Payne, another recent addition to Standard's leadership through acquisition. Snow was falling again, large flakes disappearing into the muddy slush between the tracks. Your own tank cars, Payne observed, watching the Standard-marked cars being loaded. I questioned the expense when I ran my own operation. Now I see the wisdom. Control, Rockefeller said simply. We eliminate variables. We own the barrels, we own the tank cars, we own the warehouses. Each link in the chain secured. He stopped walking and surveyed the busy yard. Most refiners think themselves in the oil business. We are in the efficiency business. Oil is merely our canvas. Later that evening, Rockefeller sat in the parlor of his home, his children playing quietly nearby while he read correspondence. Laura worked on her embroidery across from him, the lamplight making her face a study in warm shadows. The Chronicle had another editorial today, she said without looking up. They called you a monopolist. He acknowledged without emotion. Does it not trouble you what they write? Rockefeller set down his papers and considered the question. Would you have me answer their accusations? Enter into a public debate about business practices they cannot possibly understand? I only wonder if it pains you, the mischaracterization of your work. He thought of the refiners he'd purchased, men who now had stable employment, stock in a growing enterprise, and a future secured against the boom and bust cycle that had ruined so many. He thought of the consumers who no longer feared their lamps exploding in their homes. He thought of the missionaries in China, whose work was funded by his Sunday school donations. In time, he said softly, results speak louder than editorials. We've reduced the price of kerosene while improving its quality. We've created stability where there was chaos. The world needs light, Laura. We provide it cheaper and safer than ever before. She studied his face in the lamplight, the deep-set eyes that revealed so little, the high forehead, the mouth that rarely smiled except in the company of family. The face of a man entirely convinced of his own rightness. God judges our hearts, John, she said finally, returning to her needlework, not our ledgers. Indeed, he replied, his tone revealing nothing of whether he found comfort or challenge in her words. And a heart untroubled by doubt is his greatest blessing. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Cleveland, covering the smokestacks and church spires alike in silent white. The refineries along the Cuyahoga, now increasingly unified under the Standard banner, glowed orange in the winter night, their flames a testament to the new empire rising from the chaos of an industry transformed. The rain had stopped by morning. Rockefeller walked to his office early, as was his custom, nodding occasionally to those who greeted him. In his pocket, he carried smooth stones, a habit he'd developed to calm himself in moments of stress, though his face never betrayed such emotions. Order, method, and absolute self-control. These were his weapons in a world of frantic speculation and emotional decision-making. Standard Oil of Ohio was no longer merely a company. It was becoming a system, comprehensive, integrated, inexorable. Cleveland had been conquered. The rest would follow, one calculated step at a time. The snowflakes fell silently outside the tall windows of 26 Broadway, settling on the sills before melting into dark rivulets that streaked down the glass. John D. Rockefeller stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the empty streets of Lower Manhattan, vacant in the wake of financial calamity. The panic of 1873 had descended upon the nation like a swift and merciless predator, leaving financial ruin in its path. "The weak are falling," he said softly, his breath barely fogging the window, as they always must. Henry Flagler, his longtime partner, sat behind him at the mahogany conference table, reviewing ledgers in the lamplight. "J. Cook's banking house," Flagler said, shaking his head. "Who would have thought? Overextended on Northern Pacific bonds." "The railroad boom couldn't continue forever," Rockefeller replied, turning from the window. His face, lean and composed with a neatly trimmed beard, betrayed nothing of his inner calculations. "But for us, Henry, this is providence." The price of crude oil had plummeted from nearly $5 a barrel to less than $2. Throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, marginal refiners were bleeding cash, watching their life's work evaporate in a matter of weeks. Outside, in the bitter Cleveland winter, bread lines stretched down streets. Unemployed ironworkers and canal laborers huddled in soup kitchens, their breath visible in the frigid air. But inside Standard Oil's offices, the atmosphere was one of quiet, intense focus. Maps covered one wall, showing the intricate network of railroads that transported their kerosene across the nation. Rockefeller moved to his desk and picked up a telegram that had arrived earlier that morning. "Anderson's refinery in Pittsburgh," he said. "They're willing to sell at our price." Samuel Andrews, the technical genius who had guided Standard's refining innovations, looked up from his calculations. "How many barrels capacity?" 800 daily. "Good equipment, though not as efficient as ours. We could improve it." Flagler smiled thinly. "That's the third this month." "And not the last," Rockefeller said. "While others retreat, we advance. While they cut production, we expand. While they surrender to circumstances, we adapt to them." That evening, in the quiet of his Cleveland home, Rockefeller sat with his Bible open before him. His wife, Laura, entered the study with a cup of tea, setting it gently beside him. "You're working late again, John," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes softening. "The Lord has provided an opportunity in this crisis. I would be remiss not to seize it. The newspapers say, men are losing everything. Families are suffering." Rockefeller closed his Bible and folded his hands atop it. "Which is why I must continue. What we're building will bring order to chaos, stability to an unstable industry. The price of kerosene falls with every efficiency we create. More homes can afford light in the darkness. Is that not a worthy purpose?" Laura studied her husband's face, the certainty in his eyes. "Just remember what you always tell the children. Wealth is a responsibility, not a privilege." He nodded, taking her hand. "And I intend to be worthy of that responsibility." The following morning, Rockefeller met with his leadership team. Maps and financial statements covered the conference table at Standard Oil's Cleveland headquarters. Outside, smoke rose from the chimneys of their refineries along the Cuyahoga River, a constant plume against the winter sky. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice measured and calm, "the present crisis will separate the wheat from the chaff. Our competitors are cutting production, hoping to ride out the storm. We will do the opposite." John Archbold, younger than the others but rising quickly through Standard's ranks, leaned forward. "The railroads are desperate. We could press for even deeper rebates." Rockefeller nodded. "Already in motion. But there's more." He unrolled a set of technical drawings. "Continuous flow refining. Instead of running our stills in batches, we keep them running 24 hours a day. Higher initial cost, but much lower per barrel expense over time." Andrews examined the drawings with a practiced eye. "We'd need to modify the cooling systems, improve the flow mechanics, but yes, it's possible." "And this," Rockefeller continued, revealing another set of plans. "Our own pipelines." A murmur went around the table. Flagler whistled softly. "The railroads won't like that," Archbold said. "The railroads need not know until it's accomplished," Rockefeller replied. "We'll acquire rights of way through intermediaries. Begin in the oil regions, connect to our refineries. Each mile of pipe cuts our transport costs significantly." Over the following years, as the Depression lingered, Standard Oil moved with methodical precision. Distressed refineries were acquired at pennies on the dollar. The company's agents negotiated ever deeper rebates from desperate railroads. then used those savings to lower prices and gain market share. In a Philadelphia hotel room in 1874, Rockefeller met with the owner of a failing refinery. Rain tapped against the window, and a coal fire burned low in the grate. "Mr. Phillips," Rockefeller said, pouring coffee for his host, "your situation is difficult but not unique. Many face similar challenges in these times." Phillips, a man with calloused hands and 20 years in the oil business, stared into his cup. "I built that refinery from nothing. Now the banks are calling my notes. What if I told you there's another way? A path that preserves the value of what you've built?" "Standard Oil wants my business? To shut it down, I suppose?" Rockefeller shook his head. "Not necessarily. We value efficiency, Mr. Phillips. If your operation is sound, it may continue under our umbrella. You would receive Standard Oil stock in exchange. Stock that, I assure you, will be worth far more in 5 years than your independent operation is today. And if I refuse," Rockefeller's expression didn't change, "then you continue alone. But consider this. We ship in greater volume than any other company. This gives us preferential rates from the railroads. We buy barrels by the hundreds of thousands, saving pennies on each. We manufacture our own sulfuric acid. Each penny saved allows us to lower prices while maintaining margins." He leaned forward slightly. "How long can you compete when our kerosene sells for less than your cost to produce it?" Phillips stared at him for a long moment. "They call you an octopus, you know, strangling the life out of independent businesses." "I prefer to think of it as the survival of the fittest," Rockefeller replied calmly. "The American public needs kerosene at prices they can afford. Fragmentation leads to waste. Integration brings efficiency." 2 days later, Phillips signed the papers. His refinery became part of the Standard Oil system, and he became a minor shareholder in a growing empire. By 1876, Standard had begun implementing its pipeline strategy. Engineers worked discreetly, securing easements through third parties. The first lines, connecting Pennsylvania oil fields to Standard refineries, were laid under cover of night in some sections to avoid sabotage from teamsters who saw their livelihood threatened. During one inspection of a newly completed pipeline segment, Rockefeller walked the route with William Vanderbilt, son of the railroad magnate Commodore Vanderbilt. "You're becoming less dependent on us," Vanderbilt observed as they stood overlooking a valley where the pipeline snaked through the trees. "It's merely economic evolution," Rockefeller replied. "Your father would understand. The commodity seeks the most efficient path to market." Vanderbilt laughed. "My father would try to buy your company or crush it. There's no middle ground for the Commodore. And yet here we are, discussing mutual interests like civilized men." Rockefeller gestured to the pipeline. "This doesn't eliminate our need for railroads. It complements them. Oil moves to our refineries by pipe. Refined products still move to market by rail." "For now," Vanderbilt said shrewdly. "The future unfolds according to its own logic," Rockefeller answered. "Those who adapt prosper, those who resist are left behind." In the offices at 26 Broadway, which had become Standard's nerve center, Rockefeller instituted a system of daily meetings with his leadership team. Around a long table, they tracked every aspect of the business: production figures, transport costs, competitor activities, political developments. "Gentlemen," he said one morning in 1879, tapping a financial report, "our margins per gallon have reached 3 cents consistently, sometimes 5. Retail kerosene sells for 10 to 15 cents. The public benefits from our scale while we prosper from our efficiency." Flagler nodded. "It's a perfect circle. More volume gives us better rates allow lower prices win more market share, more share creates more volume." "A flywheel," Rockefeller said. "Once set in motion, it accelerates under its own momentum." By 1881, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of America's refining capacity. Its operations spanned multiple states, with refineries from Cleveland to New York, pipelines across Pennsylvania, and marketing operations nationwide. But this sprawling empire faced a legal challenge. how to coordinate companies across state lines when interstate commerce law remained undeveloped. Samuel Dodd, Standard's brilliant legal mind, arrived at Rockefeller's home one evening with a solution. In the study, its walls lined with books and maps, Dodd spread out legal documents while Rockefeller listened intently. "A trust," Dodd explained. "Shareholders in our various companies would exchange their stock for certificates in a trust. 9 trustees would manage the enterprise, making decisions for all member companies." Rockefeller considered this, fingers steepled beneath his chin. And the advantage? Centralized control across state lines without the appearance of a monopoly. Each company maintains its separate legal identity, but the trust coordinates their activities for maximum efficiency. Will it withstand legal scrutiny? Dodd smiled slightly. It's based on centuries of English common law. The trust is a well-established legal instrument. We're simply applying it in the novel context. In 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formally established. 41 companies came under the control of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller as the central figure. It was a legal innovation that would become the template for industrial consolidation in the Gilded Age. On the evening of the trust's formation, Rockefeller walked alone through his garden, contemplating what they had built. The sky was deepening to purple, and the first stars appeared above the trees. From humble beginnings as a bookkeeper's assistant in Cleveland, he had constructed an enterprise unprecedented in scope and efficiency. Later that night he wrote in his journal, "The Lord has prospered us beyond measure. From chaos, we have created order. From waste, efficiency. The price of illumination falls yearly, bringing light to more homes across this nation and beyond. If that is not a worthy purpose, I know not what is." He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "Some call our methods harsh, our growth excessive. They fail to understand that the growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest. It is the working out of a law of nature and a law of God." The following morning, as Rockefeller prepared for another day of meetings, his wealth stood at approximately $10 million, a fortune built on Standard's control of 90% of America's oil refining capacity. Yet in his mind, they had only begun. The markets of Europe, Asia, and South America beckoned. The uses of petroleum were multiplying beyond illumination. As he adjusted his tie before a mirror, Rockefeller studied his own reflection. The calm eyes, the disciplined posture, the methodical movements. The panic of 1873 had destroyed countless businesses and damaged many lives. But for him, it had been the forge in which Standard's dominance was hammered into final form. Not by chance, he murmured to himself, but by design. Outside, the city was awakening. Telegraph wires hummed with commerce. Factory whistles called workers to their stations. And in homes across America, kerosene lamps waited for the coming night. When they would push back the darkness, each flame a tiny monument to the empire John D. Rockefeller had built during a time when others saw only ruin. The fog lingered in wisps across the East River as John D. Rockefeller gazed through the windows of his private railcar. Dawn painted the New York skyline in muted gold, the city's smokestacks and church spires competing for dominance against the pale sky. He folded the newspaper in his lap with methodical precision, each crease sharp as a newly minted dollar. 26 Broadway in 30 minutes, sir, his secretary announced quietly. Rockefeller merely nodded, reaching for his ledger. At 53, he commanded what many called the greatest fortune in American history, yet he remained a figure of quiet calculation. The ledger bound, in fine leather but otherwise unadorned, contained the numbers that composed the skeleton of his empire. 85% of American oil refining, 120,000 barrels processed daily, 6,000 miles of pipeline stretching like arteries across the continent, 8,000 tank cars bearing the Standard Eagle, nearly 60,000 souls in his employ. The train slowed as it entered the terminal, its brakes releasing a mournful whistle. Rockefeller closed his ledger without a hint of satisfaction crossing his features. Success was not a destination, but a process, continuous, methodical, and as relentless as the tide. Manhattan in 1887 was a city of stark contrasts. Horse-drawn carriages shared muddy streets with electric trolleys. Gilded mansions cast shadows over tenements where immigrants packed 12 to a room. The air carried the mingled scents of progress and poverty, coal smoke, horse manure, and the indefinable perfume of human ambition. Rockefeller's carriage navigated this urban tableau with practiced efficiency, the driver knowing better than to take routes that might delay his passenger. Time, Rockefeller had learned early, was the one commodity even he could not purchase. 26 Broadway rose 9 stories above the financial district, a limestone fortress housing the operational center of Standard Oil. The building was substantial without being ostentatious, much like its principal occupant. Inside, corridors hummed with disciplined energy. Clerks moved with purpose. Conversations were conducted in hushed, respectful tones. Rockefeller's office reflected his philosophy, spacious but not lavish, functional without being stark. The most prominent feature was not his desk, but the wall of maps detailing Standard's operations across the nation and increasingly the world. John Archbold and Henry Flagler were waiting, both men rising as he entered. "John," Flagler said, his handshake firm. A decade older than Rockefeller, Flagler had brought railroad expertise and strategic vision to their partnership. "The reports from Lima are excellent. The sulfur problem is being managed." Rockefeller nodded. The Lima oil fields in Ohio had seemed worthless to many due to their high sulfur content, until Standard's chemists had devised methods to refine it. Where others saw obstacles, he had learned to see opportunity. "And our friends in Bayonne?" Rockefeller inquired, settling behind his desk. "Production increased 12% this quarter," Archbold replied. "The new stills are performing beyond expectations." Rockefeller absorbed this without visible reaction. Success was expected, not celebrated. Failure was analyzed, not mourned. This was the Standard way. "And Samuel Dodd wishes to discuss the New Jersey incorporation possibilities when you have a moment," Flagler added. "He believes the trust structure may face additional legal challenges." A shadow passed across Rockefeller's face. The Standard Oil Trust, formed in 1882, had consolidated their holdings into a more manageable structure, but state attorneys had begun questioning its legality. Dodd, their legal architect, had already begun formulating contingencies. "We'll adapt," Rockefeller said simply. "We always have." Later that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across Manhattan, Rockefeller met with Charles Pratt in the building's private dining room. Once a bitter competitor, Pratt had become a valued ally after selling his Astral Oil Company to Standard. Their integration exemplified Rockefeller's philosophy: absorb talent, eliminate redundancy, reward loyalty. "The European market continues to expand," Pratt reported over a simple lunch of cold roast beef and mineral water. "Astral remains the premium brand in most markets. The Russians are increasing production, but their distribution cannot match ours." Rockefeller nodded, making a note in his ever-present pocket notebook. Standard's kerosene illuminated homes from London to Shanghai, making it one of America's dominant exports. The company's overseas salesmen, known as jobbers, maintained what amounted to petroleum embassies in dozens of countries. "And our philanthropic initiatives?" Rockefeller asked, his tone softening slightly. "The Baptist schools are thriving with the new endowments," Pratt confirmed. "The Spelman Female Seminary in particular sends its gratitude." Philanthropy was not merely charity to Rockefeller, but an extension of his business philosophy, systematic, efficient, and aimed at root causes rather than symptoms. Just as he refined crude oil into kerosene, he sought to refine society through strategic giving. The following day found Rockefeller at Standard's Brooklyn Works, where the sprawling refinery complex processed thousands of barrels daily. He walked the grounds with the plant manager, occasionally stopping to question a worker or examine equipment. Unlike some industrialists who ruled from isolated offices, Rockefeller believed in direct observation. "You've reduced waste by another 2%, he noted, studying the production figures. "Excellent. And the barrel production?" "Our Coopers are producing 1,700 daily, sir." We've implemented the new banding technique you suggested. Rockefeller nodded. Early in his refining career, he had recognized that barrels represented a significant cost, so he had built his own cooperage, then improved its efficiency until Standard produced the best barrels at the lowest cost. It was this attention to detail, multiplied across every facet of the business, that created an unassailable competitive advantage. And the men? Rockefeller asked. Any concerns with the shift schedules? None, sir. The 10-hour shifts are working well. Absenteeism is down since we implemented the bonus system. This, too, reflected Rockefeller's philosophy: hire the best people, pay them well, provide stability, and demand excellence. Standard's wages exceeded industry averages, and capable employees could expect lifetime employment, though the disloyal were swiftly identified and removed. As summer gave way to autumn, Rockefeller divided his time between New York and his Forest Hill estate outside Cleveland. The 700-acre property provided sanctuary from the ceaseless demands of empire. There, among manicured gardens and wooded paths, he could indulge his love of nature and family. One crisp October evening in 1888, he sat in his study with Mark Hanna, the Ohio industrialist and Republican power broker whose political influence extended to the highest levels of government. "The tariff bill will pass," Hanna said confidently, swirling brandy in a crystal snifter. "McKinley has the votes. And the Interstate Commerce Commission remains flexible in its interpretations." Rockefeller nodded, sipping water while his guest enjoyed spirits. His Baptist upbringing had instilled a lifelong abstention from alcohol, one of many disciplines that governed his existence. "And Senator Aldrich?" Rockefeller inquired. Hanna smiled. "A most capable legislator. His understanding of banking reform aligns remarkably with our interests." Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island had become an increasingly important connection, his legislative skill matched by his receptivity to business concerns. The relationship would soon be reinforced by family bonds when Rockefeller's daughter Abby married Aldrich's son. Rockefeller maintained a careful distance from direct political entanglement. He never testified before congressional committees if it could be avoided. He gave no public speeches, wrote no position papers, granted no interviews. Yet his influence flowed through channels like Hanna, through strategic political contributions, through the sheer economic gravity Standard exerted on the American economy. The Standard Oil philanthropic system was how Hanna once described it: invisible pipes connecting points of influence. The winter of 1889 brought troubling developments. Attorney General James Watson, responding to growing populist sentiment, launched investigations into Standard's business practices. The Sherman Antitrust Act loomed on the legislative horizon. In several states, lawmakers introduced bills specifically targeting the company's operations. In his office at 26 Broadway, Rockefeller met with Samuel Dodd, the trust's legal architect, and John S. Moores, one of Standard's chief counsels. "The Ohio situation is deteriorating," Moores reported gravely. "The Attorney General is preparing a case challenging the trust's right to operate within the state." Rockefeller's expression remained unchanged, though he tapped his fingers lightly on his desk, a rare outward sign of calculation. "And our contingencies?" he asked, looking to Dodd. The older attorney opened a leather portfolio. "New Jersey has recently amended its incorporation laws. They now explicitly permit holding companies to own stock in enterprises across state lines. Several of our competitors have already reincorporated there. A holding company," Rockefeller mused. "Not a trust, but a corporation that holds other corporations." "Precisely," Dodd confirmed. Standard Oil of New Jersey could become the parent entity. Each state operation would maintain its separate corporate existence, but would be owned by the New Jersey company. Legally distinct, but functionally integrated. Rockefeller considered this, his mind working through the implications with characteristic thoroughness. He had never sought to break laws. He considered himself a deeply moral man, but he saw legal structures as frameworks to be understood and optimally utilized. "Begin the preparations," he finally said, quietly. The year 1891 brought personal joy amidst business challenges. Rockefeller's daughter Edith married Harold McCormick, heir to the international harvester fortune, in a ceremony that united two of America's great industrial dynasties. Yet even as wedding gifts arrived at Forest Hill, legal papers were being filed in Columbus that would challenge the very structure of Standard Oil. On a snowy March morning in 1892, the news arrived by telegram. The Ohio Supreme Court had ordered the Standard Oil Trust dissolved within the state. In his private office, Rockefeller received the news with the same impassive expression he might have shown upon learning of a minor fluctuation in crude prices. Henry Flagler and John Archbold watched him carefully. "So it begins," Flagler said quietly. "So one chapter ends," Rockefeller corrected, folding the telegram with precise movements. "Another begins. Samuel Dodd's foresight has prepared us well." Within days, the machinery of transformation was in motion. Standard Oil of New Jersey, previously a minor subsidiary, began the process of becoming a holding company capitalized at $110 million. Stock in the various Standard entities would be exchanged for shares in the New Jersey Corporation. The trust would dissolve, not through defeat but evolution. "The law has not destroyed Standard Oil," Rockefeller explained to his son John Jr. during a rare moment of candor about business matters. "It has merely required us to adapt our form. The function remains unchanged." This philosophy of adaptation had defined Rockefeller's career. When crude oil prices fell, he bought refineries at distressed prices. When railroads charged excessive rates, he built pipelines. When horizontal integration reached its limits, he expanded vertically. Each obstacle became a stepping stone. Late one evening that spring, Rockefeller stood at the window of his New York mansion, watching gaslit carriages pass below. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had grown increasingly austere with age, tall, thin, the once full beard now trimmed short. Eyes set deep in a face marked by the weight of empire. "Are you troubled, John?" asked his wife, Laura, joining him at the window. Rockefeller considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Not troubled," he finally said. "Yes, contemplative. I have built something that no court decision can truly dismantle. The trust may dissolve, but the principles that created it remain. Efficiency, integration, discipline." Laura studied her husband's profile, softened in the dim light, and after, when the battles are won, "There is always an after," he replied, "always a next challenge, always more to build." He paused, his gaze turning inward, or perhaps increasingly more to give away. This was the paradox at the heart of John D. Rockefeller, the ruthless competitor who also believed deeply in stewardship, the monopolist who saw himself as serving the public good, the man who accumulated unprecedented wealth while planning its systematic distribution. As summer returned to New York in 1892, the reorganization of Standard Oil continued with mechanical precision. Rockefeller, as was his custom, retreated from direct involvement once the strategy was set, allowing Archbold, Flagler, and others to implement what he had envisioned. On a warm July evening, he took a rare moment of leisure, sitting on the veranda of his Forest Hill estate. The sun set over his carefully cultivated gardens, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, not unlike crude oil itself. His grandson toddled across the lawn, pursued by a nursemaid. Rockefeller smiled, a genuine expression rarely witnessed in boardrooms or business negotiations. Perhaps, he reflected, this was the true product of his labors, not merely an empire of oil, but a foundation for generations yet unborn. The empire stood at its zenith. 85% of American oil refining, 6,000 miles of pipeline, 8,000 tank cars, 60,000 employees, kerosene illuminating homes on 6 continents. Yet even as he contemplated these achievements, Rockefeller's mind was already turning toward the next adaptation, the next challenge, the next opportunity to bend circumstance to his immovable will. The shadows lengthened across the lawn as night approached, but John D. Rockefeller had long since learned to see clearly in darkness. After all, he had spent a lifetime transforming it into light. The sun fell behind the trees at Forest Hill, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds of John D. Rockefeller's Cleveland estate. He walked along the carriage path, his footfalls crunching softly against the gravel, each step precisely measured like entries in a ledger. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of autumn, and Rockefeller paused, running his fingers across the smooth stone he kept in his waistcoat pocket. A ritual that brought him calm in a world that increasingly demanded his absence from its daily machinations. At 54, time had begun its quiet assault. His hair had retreated entirely. Alopecia, the doctors called it, leaving his scalp bare and vulnerable to the elements. He wore a skull cap beneath his hat, an inconspicuous shield against the world. More troubling were the digestive ailments that plagued him, transforming meals into calculations of risk and discomfort. 28, 29, 30, he counted silently, chewing a simple morsel of chicken with methodical precision. Fletcherism, they called this new dietary discipline, chewing each bite dozens of times until it nearly dissolved. Like the business of oil, it was a process of refinement, of breaking complex matters into their simplest components. "You must slow down, John," Dr. Bigger had told him months earlier, after a particularly severe bout of digestive distress. "Your body cannot sustain this pace. The nervous system has its limits, even yours." Rockefeller had nodded, accustomed to seeing problems as equations waiting to be balanced. If his health required a new system, he would design one with the same precision he had applied to petroleum. The new regimen was strict: morning prayers at dawn, a breakfast of crackers and milk, daily walks regardless of weather, afternoon naps timed to exactly 20 minutes, and a dinner so simple it would make a monastery seem indulgent. No alcohol past his lips, nor tobacco, nor rich sauces, nor excessive meats. Mr. Rockefeller, called Frederick Gates, emerging from the modest cottage Rockefeller preferred to the grand main house on the estate. Gates, with his clipped beard and penetrating eyes, had been a Baptist minister before becoming Rockefeller's most trusted advisor in matters of philanthropy. He carried a leather portfolio and a telegram. "Frederick," Rockefeller acknowledged, his voice soft but clear. "I trust you've considered the University of Chicago matter." Gates nodded, falling into step beside his employer. "President Harper's expansion plans are ambitious. The laboratory facilities alone would require an additional $3 million. And will they advance knowledge in measurable ways?" Rockefeller asked, his mind calculating return on investment not in dollars but in human advancement. "I believe they will. Harper has assembled some of the finest scientific minds in the country. With proper facilities, their work could transform medicine, physics." "Then we shall provide," Rockefeller said simply. "But through the proper channels, with the proper oversight. No blank checks, Frederick." They continued walking, discussing the transformation of the university that Rockefeller had founded just a few years earlier. By 1893, his contributions had already reshaped American higher education, creating in Chicago an institution that could rival the established powers of the East. It was not vanity that drove him, but a Baptist sense of stewardship. Wealth was a trust, to be deployed with the same efficiency that had created it. Gates had changed everything about Rockefeller's giving. Before his arrival in 1891, charity had been retail responses to letters, donations to churches, aid to widows. Now it was wholesale, institutional, measured. Every dollar given was expected to multiply in impact, like capital properly invested. "And the Mesabi situation?" Rockefeller inquired, shifting topics with the ease of a man accustomed to holding entire industries in his mental ledger. "The acquisitions continue quietly," Gates replied. "We now control nearly 60% of the high-grade ore fields, and the railroad is secured. Mr. Merritt remains, unaware of the full extent of our position." Rockefeller allowed himself a thin smile. The Mesabi Range in Minnesota represented perhaps his most significant investment outside petroleum, vast fields of iron ore near the surface. Easily mined, strategic to America's industrial future. While others had focused on the more famous Vermilion Range, Rockefeller had seen the Mesabi's potential and moved methodically to control both the ore and its transportation via the Duluth, Mississippi and Northern Railroad. And what of Standard's operations? Has Archbold telegraphed today? Yes, sir. The Lima refineries are operating at 90% capacity despite the continued depression. Mr. Archbold believes we may weather this panic better than most. The panic of 1893 had devastated America's economy. Banks failed by the hundreds. Railroads entered receivership. Unemployment reached unprecedented levels. Yet Standard Oil, with its efficient operations and minimal debt, continued to generate profits while competitors faltered. "Tell John I have full confidence in his management," Rockefeller said, referring to John D. Archbold, who had increasingly assumed day-to-day control of Standard Oil. "He needn't consult me on operational matters unless absolutely necessary." This was Rockefeller's new role, the strategic investor rather than the operational manager. The company he had built from a small Cleveland refinery into the world's most powerful corporation now functioned largely without his direct involvement. He had assembled a team of lieutenants so capable that his presence was no longer required in the daily affairs of Standard Oil. That evening, as was his custom, Rockefeller sat in his study reviewing correspondence. The ritual brought order to his world. Each letter addressed, each commitment noted, each figure reconciled. Beside him, a small kerosene lamp cast a warm glow across the desk, a reminder of the product that had built his fortune. "Father," came a soft voice from the doorway. John D. Rockefeller Jr., just entering adulthood, stood with perfect posture, already showing signs of the seriousness that would define his life. "Junior," Rockefeller acknowledged, using the family's name for his only son. "Come in. You've reviewed the Pocantico Hills plans." The younger Rockefeller nodded, approaching his father's desk with a portfolio of architectural drawings. "The land acquisitions are proceeding, though not without some resistance from the smaller holders. The Westchester property will eventually encompass over 3,000 acres, as you envisioned. The estate at Pocantico Hills, north of New York City, was to be the family's eastern anchor, a counterbalance to Forest Hill. Unlike the Vanderbilts and Astors with their ostentatious mansions, Rockefeller preferred more modest dwellings set within vast, preserved landscapes. Kequit, the grand house that would eventually crown the property, remained a future project, one that Junior would largely oversee in the coming decades. "And your studies?" the elder Rockefeller inquired, forever mindful that wealth without purpose created weakness. "Brown University continues to challenge me. Professor Jameson's economic history course has been particularly illuminating regarding the railroad consolidations of the past decade." Rockefeller nodded approvingly. His children, 4 daughters, and this sole son had been raised with weekly allowances and accounting books. Each was expected to give a portion to charity, to save a portion, and to justify expenditures. Wealth, in the Rockefeller household, was a responsibility that required training. "You understand, Junior, that as this depression continues, our relative position strengthens," Rockefeller said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Many will lose everything. We must be especially mindful of our stewardship in these times." "Yes, Father." The next morning broke clear and cold over Forest Hill. Rockefeller rose before dawn, as was his custom, reading scripture by lamplight before dressing for his morning walk. His valet helped him into a dark woolen coat, handed him his hat and walking stick, and opened the door to the crisp November air. The estate's 700 acres provided ample space for contemplation. Rockefeller walked briskly despite his age, his mind turning to the Mesabi investment. Iron ore would build the next century as surely as oil had transformed the current one. America's railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers all depended on steel, and steel required iron. The Mesabi Range, with its extraordinary reserves, represented not just profit, but leverage in the industrial age. "Good morning, Mr. Rockefeller." Charles Pratt, Jr., son of Rockefeller's longtime business associate, approached on horseback, slowing to match Rockefeller's pace. "Charles," Rockefeller acknowledged with a nod, "you're out early." "Father always said you caught the best ideas with the morning dew," the younger man replied with a smile. "I've just received word from our Pittsburgh operations. Carnegie's furnaces are running day and night despite the depression. Steel demand may be the first sector to recover." Rockefeller absorbed this information silently. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, would eventually need the Mesabi ore that Rockefeller now controlled. It was not a confrontational strategy. Rockefeller had long ago learned that direct competition wasted resources. Rather, it was positional, creating value through coordination rather than conflict. "And how is your father's health?" Rockefeller inquired, genuine concern in his voice. Charles Pratt Sr. had been among the early oil refiners absorbed into Standard Oil, becoming one of Rockefeller's most valued partners. "Improving, thank you. The physicians believe the mountain air has done him good." Rockefeller nodded, making a mental note to write to the elder Pratt. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness in business, he maintained deep, lasting relationships with his inner circle. The bonds formed during Standard Oil's creation, with Flagler, Andrews, Pratt and others, remained sacred to him, part of the human architecture supporting his empire. By 1897, Rockefeller's daily involvement with Standard Oil had diminished to quarterly strategy sessions and major investment decisions. John Archbold, with his boundless energy and political acumen, managed the operational empire. Henry Rogers handled the intricate transportation networks. Each lieutenant controlled his domain with autonomy, earned through years of demonstrated competence. On a cool spring afternoon, Rockefeller sat in a rocking chair on the porch of his Forest Hill cottage, a telegram in his hand. It contained a single set of numbers, production figures from the Mesabi operations, showing extraction rates exceeding even the most optimistic projections. "The ore quality tests confirm our earlier samples," reported Gates, who sat nearby reviewing geological surveys. 65% iron content, minimal phosphorus, easily processed. The Pittsburgh furnaces could reduce their coke usage by nearly 20% with ore of this quality. Rockefeller nodded, mentally calculating the implications. J.P. Morgan was consolidating the steel industry as Rockefeller had once consolidated oil. Eventually, Morgan would need to secure reliable ore supplies for his new creation, U.S. Steel. "When the time comes," Rockefeller said quietly, "Morgan will pay a fair price for what we've built, not because of sentiment, but because of necessity." This was Rockefeller's genius, seeing value where others saw only dirt and rock, building integrated systems rather than isolated assets. The Mesabi holdings weren't simply mines. They were a strategic position in America's industrial future, acquired when most still focused on the more developed Vermilion Range. The Sabbath remained sacred in Rockefeller's life, regardless of business pressures or health concerns. Each Sunday found him in church, head bowed in prayer, the wealthiest man in America, indistinguishable from any other congregant in his simple devotion. Afterward, he would rest, read scripture, and spend time with family. No business discussed, no telegrams answered. "It is the Lord's Day," he would remind anyone who attempted to raise business matters. 6 days are sufficient for the affairs of men. This strict observance was not for show. Rockefeller's Baptist faith formed the bedrock of his worldview. Wealth was a divine trust. Accumulation without purpose was sin. His growing philanthropy, the University of Chicago, medical research, education for freed slaves through organizations like the General Education Board, reflected a conviction that Providence had blessed him for greater purposes. By 1901, as a new century dawned, the Mesabi strategy reached its conclusion. J.P. Morgan, assembling U.S. Steel into the world's first billion-dollar corporation, needed Rockefeller's Minnesota ore lands. The negotiations were handled through intermediaries, with Rockefeller characteristically absent from direct discussions. Morgan offers $80 million cash, plus approximately $8 million in securities, Gates reported, standing in Rockefeller's study at Pocantico Hills, where construction of the family's more permanent structures had begun. Rockefeller sat silently for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The amount represented his single largest profit outside of Standard Oil, a vindication of strategic patience and integrated thinking. "The terms are acceptable," he said finally. "Draw up the agreements." When the papers were signed, Rockefeller didn't celebrate. Instead, he recorded the transaction in his ledger with the same methodical precision he'd used to note his first earnings as a boy. The money would be reinvested, some in careful market positions, some in real estate, but increasingly in philanthropic endeavors designed to address root causes rather than symptoms. That evening, as was his custom, Rockefeller retired early. His bedroom was Spartan by the standards of America's wealthy, a simple bed, plain furnishings, nothing ostentatious or excessive. He removed his skullcap and placed it on the nightstand beside a well-worn Bible. From his pocket, he took the smooth stones he carried for comfort, arranging them in a perfect row. The digestive troubles that had once threatened his health had subsided under his disciplined regimen. The stress-induced alopecia remained, a visible reminder of the physical cost his empire had extracted. But at 62, he had achieved what few men could claim, not just extraordinary wealth, but a system for deploying it toward lasting human benefit. As lamplight cast soft shadows across the room, Rockefeller closed his eyes, his mind turning not to oil fields or iron ore or stock certificates, but to the university rising in Chicago, to the researchers battling disease, to the schools educating those society had overlooked. His breathing slowed, measured and regular like the tick of a finely crafted watch. Outside, America hurtled toward a new century of automobiles, electricity, and industrial might a world Standard Oil had helped create. And that John D. Rockefeller was now helping to civilize, one institutionalized dollar at a time. In the winter of 1902, shadows lingered longer across Cleveland's Euclid Avenue. The maples stood bare as John D. Rockefeller sat in his study, morning light filtering through leaded glass windows onto the mahogany desk where McClure's magazine lay open. His hand, spotted with age but steady, rested on a page bearing his own likeness, a stern portrait beneath the headline, "The History of the Standard Oil Company." He studied Ida Tarbell's words with the same methodical attention he once gave to ledger books. The daughter of a Pennsylvania oilman, one of the many independent Standard had absorbed decades ago, had spent 2 years investigating his empire. Now her serial exposé was captivating the nation, installment by installment. This was the third in what would become 19 devastating chapters. "She has been most thorough," Rockefeller murmured to himself, his voice soft in the quiet room. Not a hint of anger colored his tone, merely observation, as if remarking on changing weather. His secretary entered with a telegraph. "Sir, Mr. Archbold requests your thoughts on responding to the article." Rockefeller folded the magazine closed. "Tell John what I've always maintained. Never complain, never explain." The secretary hesitated. "The board believes silence makes us appear guilty." "Appearing guilty to whom?" Rockefeller's blue eyes sharpened. "The courts will decide on evidence, not magazine stories. The public will remember whatever confirms their existing beliefs." He straightened his collar. "A lawsuit against McClure's would only force our documents into the open. We will not sue." After the secretary departed, Rockefeller moved to the window. The world outside was transforming. Automobiles, still novelties, but growing more common, puttered past horse-drawn carriages. Electric trolleys hummed along tracks where omnibuses once rolled. Progress was relentless, indifferent to those who failed to adapt. Much like Miss Tarbell's investigation. That evening, Rockefeller dined with his legal counsel, Samuel Dodd, at a private room in the Union Club. Gas chandeliers cast warm light across white tablecloths and heavy silverware as they ate in relative silence. The sounds of Cleveland's commercial district, now fading as night fell, seemed a world away. "The Elkins Act passed the Senate," Dodd said finally, dabbing his mustache with a linen napkin. "Roosevelt will sign it." Rockefeller nodded, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "And so the rebates become fully illegal." "Yes. The railroads themselves will face penalties for offering them." Dodd's voice remained measured, but concern shadowed his eyes. "The legal landscape is shifting beneath us, John." "The landscape has always shifted. We've weathered worse." "Have we?" Dodd set down his fork. "The Industrial Commission testimony hurt you. Those, I don't recall answers." I testified truthfully. A rare edge entered Rockefeller's voice. Many of those questions concerned operations from 20 years ago. Should I have invented memories to satisfy them? No, but the public sees only evasion. Now Tarbell documents every rebate, every case of industrial espionage, every instance of predatory pricing. Dodd leaned forward. The octopus, she calls us. The name is sticking. Rockefeller's face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly around his water glass. The Bible teaches us that a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. I've always believed that, but I cannot control what others choose to believe about me. Later, as his carriage returned him home through streets now lit by electric lamps, Rockefeller contemplated the two competing narratives of his life's work. In his mind, he had built standard through efficiency and stewardship, eliminating waste, standardizing production, bringing order to chaos. Yet to his critics, he was merely a predator who had bribed officials and crushed smaller firms beneath his heel. Both stories contained measures of truth. Neither was complete. Spring 1903 brought new growth to Forest Hill, Rockefeller's estate. As he walked the grounds with his daughter Bessie, cherry blossoms scented the air. At 63, he moved more deliberately than in his youth, but maintained the erect posture and measured pace that had long been his hallmark. "Father, have you read this month's installment?" Bessie asked, referencing Tarbell's continuing series. "I have." He paused to examine a flowering bush. "Miss Tarbell is quite thorough in her research." "She makes you sound monstrous." Bessie's protective instinct flared, as if he delight in crushing competitors. Rockefeller smiled gently. "The tiger cannot persuade the gazelles that he is a vegetarian, my dear. But these quotations she attributes to you. Competition is a sin. Did you ever say such things?" "No." He shook his head. "Though I've certainly witnessed the ruinous effects of unrestrained competition. When too many men rush into a promising field, they often destroy themselves and the field with them." He bent to inspect a new sprout pushing through soil. "Nature itself teaches us that resources are best used with care, not squandered. The papers say President Roosevelt calls you a malefactor of great wealth." Rockefeller's expression revealed nothing. The president is a complicated man. He admires efficiency and achievement, yet feels compelled to attack the vehicles of that achievement. He straightened. "I've never met him personally. Perhaps one day." As they continued walking, Rockefeller considered Theodore Roosevelt a whirlwind of energy and contradiction, a man who had once worked with business leaders like himself but now found political advantage in opposing them. The president walked a tightrope between progressive reforms and conservative economic principles, between challenging trusts and respecting property rights. Rockefeller understood such balancing acts. He had performed his own for decades. The offices of Standard Oil at 26 Broadway in New York City hummed with activity despite the summer heat of 1904. John D. Archbold, Rockefeller's right-hand man and the company's day-to-day leader, paced before windows overlooking the financial district where American capitalism's heart beat strongest. "The final installments of Tarbell's series will publish this fall," Archbold said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Our sources say she saved her most damning material for last." Rockefeller, seated in a leather chair, remained still. His face, more deeply lined than just a few years earlier, betrayed nothing of his thoughts. "Has our legal position changed?" "No," replied Charles Pratt, another long-time associate. "But our public position worsens by the month. McClure's circulation has doubled since the series began. Every newspaper in the country reprints excerpts. And now this business with Hearst's paper claiming they've found secret standard documents," Archbold added. "Policies for destroying competitors, internal memos." "Fabrications," Rockefeller interrupted softly, "or mischaracterizations. The distinction matters little in the court of public opinion." Archbold ran a hand through his thinning hair. "John, perhaps it's time we engaged a publicity expert. Ivy Lee has approached us with a proposal." "No." Rockefeller's tone was quiet but final. "We will not dignify these attacks with responses. Our work speaks for itself. Standard Oil has brought light to millions of homes at prices that fall year after year. We employ thousands and pay them well. Our efficiency benefits this nation. The public sees only the octopus, Pratt said. They've forgotten the kerosene that once cost 50 cents a gallon now costs less than 10. Rockefeller gazed out the window, where the Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the East River, a monument to engineering and vision, much like Standard itself. People believe what reinforces their existing views. Those who value enterprise will see our achievements. Those who fear size itself will see only menace. And Judge Landis, the Department of Justice? Archbold pressed. We will meet them in court with facts, not newspapers. As the meeting concluded, Rockefeller remained seated, contemplating. Outside, newsboys shouted headlines about Roosevelt's campaign against trusts and monopolies. The president was riding a wave of public sentiment that Standard's own success had helped create. The very efficiency that had built their empire now made them a target. The irony was not lost on him. Winter, 1905. Snow-blanketed Cleveland as Rockefeller sat before the fireplace in his library, Bible open on his lap. For decades, he had begun each day with scripture, finding in its pages both spiritual comfort and practical wisdom. Tonight, however, his mind wandered from the text. Earlier that day, his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had telephoned from New York with news that Attorney General William Moody was preparing a massive antitrust case against Standard Oil. Roosevelt's administration, seeking both justice and political advantage, had decided to move beyond rhetoric to action. The fire crackled. Rockefeller closed his Bible and gazed into the flames. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of his age. The empire he had built over 4 decades, brick by painstaking brick-faced dismantlement by forces beyond his control. His reputation, once a matter of pride, had become a liability to the very enterprise he had nurtured. I should perhaps have retired years ago, he murmured to the empty room, handed everything to Junior and Archbold, removed myself as a target. He had nearly done so after the Industrial Commission hearings in 1899, when his faltering memory made him appear evasive and dishonest. But pride, or perhaps duty, had kept him at Standard's helm, even as he gradually delegated day-to-day operations. Now, as 70 approached, he contemplated retreat, not from business entirely, but from Standard's front lines. His charitable work called to him more insistently each year. The University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board all needed guidance, vision, funds. Perhaps in philanthropy he might yet reshape how history would remember him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His wife, Seti, entered, her face concerned in the firelight. "You missed dinner," she said gently. "Are you unwell?" "Just thinking." He offered a small smile. "I almost quit today. Told Junior I would step away entirely." She sat beside him, taking his hand. After 50 years of marriage, words were often unnecessary between them. "But you won't," she said simply. "No." He squeezed her fingers. "Not yet. But I'll do more through giving, less through managing. Let the company weather this storm with younger captains. And let them say what they will about John D. Rockefeller." His smile turned wry. "They always have." The following spring, Rockefeller stood with Frederick T. Gates, his philanthropic advisor, surveying a model of the Rockefeller Institute's new laboratories on Manhattan's East Side. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the miniature buildings where scientists would soon work to conquer disease. "Construction proceeds on schedule," Gates reported, his eyes bright with enthusiasm behind spectacles. "The best minds in medical science are joining us. Dr. Flexner believes we may make substantial progress against meningitis within the year." Rockefeller nodded, studying the model with genuine interest. Here was creation without controversy work no newspaper could reasonably attack. "And the General Education Board?" he asked. "We've approved grants to 17 colleges last month alone. The focus on the South is yielding results. Literacy rates are rising." Rockefeller allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. While Standard fought for its existence in courtrooms, while cartoonists depicted him as an octopus strangling America, this work continued quietly, reshaping the nation in ways few recognized. "Sir," Gates ventured. "The board wonders if you might consider increasing your personal visibility with these projects. If the public saw you as the man behind these gifts, rather than merely Standard's founder." "The gifts must stand on their own merit," Rockefeller interrupted. "Attaching my name more prominently would only taint them in some eyes." Gates nodded, recognizing the wisdom. "As you wish, though I maintain that history will judge your philanthropy as equal to your business achievements." "Perhaps." Rockefeller straightened his tie. "But we work for higher judgment than history's, do we not?" Later that afternoon, alone in his office, Rockefeller read the news that Roosevelt's Justice Department had filed formal antitrust proceedings against Standard Oil of New Jersey. The long-threatened blow had finally fallen. Years of legal battles lay ahead. He set the paper aside and opened his account book. For decades, he had recorded every penny spent, invested, and donated. The habit, formed in youth from necessity, had become ritual. The neat columns testified to a life of discipline and purpose. On a fresh page, he began calculating a new donation to the Institute Funds for Research on Infectious Diseases. As his pen moved across paper, creating order from complexity, he found his center once more. Outside his window, New York City churned with activity. Automobiles replacing carriages, electric lights replacing gas, a new century asserting itself over the old. Somewhere in that city, government lawyers prepared their case against his life's work. Journalists crafted tomorrow's critiques. The machinery of public opinion ground forward. But in this quiet room, John D. Rockefeller continued the work he had always done, building something he believed would endure. The cold November rain tapped against the leaded glass windows of John D. Rockefeller's study at Pocantico Hills. Though the room was warmed by a carefully banked fire, there was a different sort of chill in the industrialist's bones as he studied the newspaper before him. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey et al. Versus United States, read the headline. The Supreme Court had rendered its verdict, and the empire he had built over 4 decades would be dismantled within 6 months. Rockefeller's weathered hands, spotted with age, folded the newspaper with deliberate precision. At 72, his face had long since settled into deep carved lines, his once robust frame now thinner, more austere. Yet his eyes remained penetrating, their calculation undiminished by the years. He rose slowly and walked to the window, watching raindrops trace meandering paths down the glass. Outside, the Hudson Valley stretched beneath low clouds, his estate's carefully manicured grounds fading into mist. Behind him, the grandfather clock ticked away minutes that no longer seemed urgent to a man who had withdrawn from daily operations years earlier. "Will you appeal further, Father?" The voice belonged to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., 37 years old, and increasingly the family's public face. The elder Rockefeller didn't turn immediately. "No, Junior. The decision is unanimous." His voice carried the same measured cadence that had guided boardroom discussions for decades. "Chief Justice White has spoken. The rule of reason, he calls it." Junior approached, standing beside his father at the window. Unlike the elder Rockefeller's Spartan appearance, Junior's suit was impeccably tailored, his countenance that of a modern businessman ready for the new century. "The papers are calling it the death of Standard Oil," Junior said, concern evident in his tone. A faint smile touched the corners of the elder man's mouth. "The papers have been predicting my demise for 30 years. "This is different," Junior insisted. 34 separate companies within 6 months, everything we built. "Everything we built," his father corrected gently, "was never about the structure, but the capability. The court can dissolve Standard Oil of New Jersey, but they cannot dissolve what made it work." The rain intensified, drumming against the glass. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley. 4 years earlier, in the austere chamber of the United States District Court in Chicago, Judge Kennesaw Mountain, Landis had glowered down from his bench at the attorneys representing Standard Oil. Rockefeller himself was not present. His doctors had advised against the strain of testimony, a recommendation that aligned with his lifelong aversion to public scrutiny. $29,240,000, Judge Landis had pronounced. the fine so enormous that the courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. When the news reached Rockefeller on the golf course at Pocantico Hills, he merely lined up his putt and sent the ball into the cup with characteristic precision. The maximum penalty under the Elkins Act, his companion had remarked, visibly shaken. And it will be overturned on appeal, Rockefeller had replied, his confidence unrattled. The law doesn't permit such an accumulation of penalties. He had been right. The Circuit Court of Appeals had indeed vacated the fine. But the spectacle had accomplished what years of newspaper attacks had failed to do. It had cemented in the public mind the image of Standard Oil as an outlaw enterprise, and of Rockefeller himself as its unrepentant architect. In his New York office on a grey afternoon in early 1910, Rockefeller sat across from his most trusted financial advisor, Frederick Gates. Between them lay spreadsheets detailing Standard Oil's holdings, their value, and projected revenues. "The Justice Department's case before the Supreme Court is strong," Gates said, adjusting his spectacles. "We should prepare for dissolution." Rockefeller nodded, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. "And if dissolution comes?" Gates slid forward a document filled with calculations and projections. "I've analyzed the likely outcomes. If Standard is broken into its constituent companies, and shareholders receive proportional stakes in each new entity, we would own pieces instead of the whole," Rockefeller finished. "Precisely. And those pieces would be free to compete, expand, adapt." Gates hesitated, then added, "They might, in aggregate, become more valuable than the consolidated company." Rockefeller studied the figures, his mind working through the implications with the same methodical analysis that had built Standard Oil from a single Cleveland refinery. "The automobile is no longer a plaything for the wealthy," he observed. "Ford's production lines make them accessible to the common man. Indeed, gasoline demand is rising exponentially. And gasoline was once a waste product we struggled to dispose of," Rockefeller said with quiet irony. A rare smile crossed Gates's stern features. "The world changes, Mr. Rockefeller." The industrialist rose and walked to the window, looking out at the city where financial destinies were written and rewritten daily. Perhaps what the government intends as punishment may prove otherwise. The day the Supreme Court decision was announced, May 15, 1911, Rockefeller was visiting his Forest Hill estate in Cleveland. His morning had followed its usual pattern: rise before dawn, read the Bible, take a simple breakfast, and review the day's correspondence. When his secretary brought the telegram, he received the news with the same impassivity that had characterized his response to both triumph and setback. "The court has ruled against us," he told his wife, Seti, as they walked through gardens brightened by spring blossoms. Seti, her health fragile in recent years, squeezed his arm gently. "You expected this?" "Yes." His voice carried no bitterness. "The wind has been blowing this way for some time. And now? Now we adjust, as we always have." He paused beside a flowering dogwood. "The structures change, but the fundamentals remain." As they continued their walk, he explained how the dismantling would proceed, each piece of Standard becoming its own entity. Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, and dozens of others, all soon to be competitors in name, yet connected by a shared heritage of disciplined management and operational excellence. "And will you fight it?" Seti asked. "No." His response was immediate and certain. "We accept the court's decision and move forward. Fighting would only prolong uncertainty, and markets abhor uncertainty." That evening, reporters gathered at the gates of Forest Hill, hoping for a statement from the man whose company had just been ordered dismantled. They received instead a brief comment from a secretary. "Mr. Rockefeller says he has nothing to say." In the months that followed, as Standard's attorneys worked to implement the court's dissolution order, Rockefeller maintained his ritual-driven life. Mornings devoted to correspondence, afternoons to golf or carriage rides through his estates, evenings to family and rest. To observers, it might have seemed the routine of a man disconnected from business concerns. Nothing could have been further from reality. In his study at Pocantico Hills one September evening, Rockefeller reviewed papers with John Archbold. the man who had effectively run Standard Oil during Rockefeller's gradual withdrawal from operations. The transition proceeds smoothly, Archbold reported. Each new company will have the assets and management needed to succeed independently. Rockefeller nodded, studying a diagram of the dissolution. And our shareholders? Will receive proportional stakes in each new entity. Your personal holdings will translate directly. Rockefeller traced a finger along the list of successor companies. Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California. Each name represented a piece of the empire that would now chart its own course. Some predict chaos, Archbold continued. Price wars, market confusion. They misunderstand, Rockefeller said. These companies aren't starting from nothing. They inherit decades of operational discipline, cost control, and market knowledge. And they inherit your methods, Archbold added with a knowing smile. Rockefeller permitted himself a small nod. Methods that work regardless of corporate structure. As Archbold gathered his papers to leave, he paused. There's talk that this breakup might actually increase your wealth in time, the parts potentially worth more than the whole. Perhaps, Rockefeller said non-committally, the market will decide. After Archbold departed, Rockefeller sat alone in his study, contemplating the transformation about to occur. The antitrust crusaders believed they were punishing Standard Oil and its architect. What they failed to comprehend was that the true value had never resided in the corporate structure, but in the fundamental economics of the business, the relentless pursuit of efficiency. The elimination of waste, the constant improvement of processes. These things couldn't be dissolved by judicial decree. November 1911. The 6-month deadline imposed by the Supreme Court approached. In the financial districts of New York, Boston, and Chicago, investors speculated on the future of the 34 companies about to emerge from Standard Oil's dissolution. At his desk in the family's Manhattan offices, John D. Rockefeller Jr. studied market reports with growing amazement. The combined market value is rising, he told his father during their weekly meeting. Investors are bidding up the anticipated shares of the successor companies. The elder Rockefeller nodded, seemingly unsurprised. The uncertainty is lifting. The market can now value each business on its own merits. Your personal wealth, Junior began, is of secondary concern, his father interrupted gently. What matters is that these companies continue to operate efficiently, provide quality products, employ good people, and generate fair returns. Junior smiled slightly at the familiar philosophy. Nevertheless, preliminary calculations suggest your net worth may approach $900 million once the new shares are trading. The figure hung in the air between them, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. If true, the elder Rockefeller said after a moment, it only increases our responsibility. The Foundation's endowment? Junior asked. Yes. Rockefeller's eyes lit with the only true passion he publicly displayed, his vision for philanthropy. With greater resources comes greater capacity to address humanity's needs scientifically, systematically. Junior nodded, understanding. While the world focused on the dissolution of Standard Oil, his father was already looking beyond, to the institutions that would long outlast both the company and the man who built it. December 1, 1911. The dissolution was complete. Standard Oil of New Jersey had been broken into 34 separate companies, each now trading independently on various exchanges. In his study at Pocantico Hills, Rockefeller received the final report from his financial advisors. The combined value exceeds our projections, Frederick Gates informed him. The market has responded positively to each entity. Rockefeller studied the figures without comment. The companies that would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others were already attracting investor interest as independent concerns. Own the pieces, not the structure, Gates remarked, echoing a phrase Rockefeller had used throughout the dissolution process. The lesson is older than Standard Oil, Rockefeller replied. King Solomon understood it 3,000 years ago. Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again. Give portions to 7, yes, to 8, for you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. Gates nodded. appreciating as always his employer's ability to find biblical wisdom applicable to modern business. Outside, the December twilight settled over Pocantico Hills. The year was ending, and with it, an era in American business. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the company that had revolutionized an industry and transformed global energy markets, existed no more. Yet its architect seemed untouched by melancholy. For John D. Rockefeller, the passing of Standard Oil represented not an ending, but a transition from a single, visible enterprise to a constellation of companies carrying forward the principles he had instilled. As Gates departed, Rockefeller remained at his desk, opening his ledger, the descendant of the accounting books he had kept since boyhood. With meticulous care, he updated the entries, recording the new shape of his holdings. Though the form had changed, the substance remained: ownership in businesses built on efficiency, positioned for growth in a world increasingly hungry for energy. The clock in the hall struck 6, its chime echoing through the quiet house. Outside his window, the first stars appeared in the winter sky. John D. Rockefeller closed his ledger and rose from his desk, a man secure in the knowledge that what he had built would endure. Not despite the government's antitrust remedy, but in many ways because of it. The Standard was gone. The Standard remained. The grandfather clock in the east wing of Pocantico Hills chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through marble halls. John D. Rockefeller sat alone in his study, a single lamp casting shadows across ledgers spread before him. Outside, a late autumn rain tapped against leaded glass windows, nature's subtle reminder of time's passage. At 74, Rockefeller's frame had grown thinner, but his blue eyes retained their penetrating quality. His fingers, once calloused from counting coins in Cleveland commission houses, now moved deliberately across columns of figures, calculations of charitable deductions from the newly implemented federal income tax. "Every cent the law requires," he murmured to himself, a mantra repeated to journalists whenever the subject arose. The 16th Amendment had changed the rules of American wealth in 1930, introducing a graduated income tax that began at 1% and rose to 7% for men of his fortune. Rockefeller did not object. In his mind, lawful taxation and strategic philanthropy formed two sides of the same coin, a system of ordered giving. Frederick Gates entered with a soft knock, carrying fresh reports on the Rockefeller Foundation's first year of operation. Though the hour was late, Gates knew his employer's habits. The old man required little sleep, and the quiet hours after dinner often proved most productive. "The foundation charter has been fully implemented," Gates said, settling into a leather chair across from Rockefeller. $100 million in initial endowment, with the remaining $83 million to follow. The mission statement emphasizes promoting the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Rockefeller nodded, satisfied. The foundation complemented his earlier creations. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, established in 1901, and the General Education Board of 1902. A triptych of institutional giving designed to outlast mortal life. The newspapers still call it blood money, Gates added carefully. The socialist press especially. "They have been calling it that since before you were born, Frederick," Rockefeller replied, his voice like dry leaves. "The money itself is neither good nor evil. Its effects depend on its application." He rose slowly and moved to the window, watching raindrops trace paths down darkened glass. He had long ago learned to separate his interior self from public perception. The structure of his giving endowments rather than direct charity, institutions rather than individuals, reflected this philosophy. Build systems that would continue without his hand on the tiller. "Have you read the Colorado reports?" Gates asked, changing the subject to the matter they both knew weighed heaviest. Rockefeller's silence answered before his words. "I have. Junior is handling it." The Colorado situation had festered throughout 1913 and exploded in 1914. The United Mine Workers had called a strike against Colorado Fuel and Iron, where the Rockefeller interests held a controlling stake. The company had resisted, importing strikebreakers and hiring guards. Then came April 20th, the day that would be known as the Ludlow Massacre. National Guardsmen and company guards had fired on a tent colony of striking miners and their families. When the smoke cleared, 20 people lay dead, including 11 children and 2 women who suffocated in a pit beneath a burning tent. Junior testified well before the Congressional Committee, Gates offered. He's touring the camps now, meeting with miners directly. He feels responsible, Rockefeller said quietly, as he should. We hold our investments to account. The old man did not mention his own silence on the matter, a strategic withdrawal that allowed his son to become the family's voice. John Jr. had appeared before the Commission on Industrial Relations, defending the family's position while acknowledging that changes were needed. The father would remain the Sphinx, letting the son bear the public burden. The public reaction to Ludlow had been swift and vicious. Protesters had marched outside 26 Broadway, the Standard Oil headquarters. Hearst newspapers printed illustrations of the children's bodies. The family name, never beloved by the masses, had reached a nadir of public opinion. Mr. Lee has prepared some recommendations, Gates said, producing another folder. Ivy Lee, hired in the wake of Ludlow, represented something new in American business, the professional image maker. The former journalist understood the power of narrative and had proposed a radical shift in Rockefeller's public engagement, from silence to curated transparency. He believes you should be more visible, Gates continued. Carefully staged appearances, photographs of everyday activities, golf, church attendance, humanizing moments. Rockefeller returned to his desk and opened the folder. Lee's memorandum outlined a comprehensive strategy for reshaping public perception. Less robber baron, more benevolent patriarch. The centerpiece was disarmingly simple. Photographs of Rockefeller handing dimes to children, a practice he had occasionally followed for years, but which Lee proposed to elevate into a defining symbol. The dime giving costs nothing but alters everything, Lee had written. It creates an image of generosity on a human scale, complementing the institutional millions. What do you think, Frederick? Rockefeller asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided. I think Mr. Lee understands something fundamental about this new century, Gates replied. Money and power are no longer sufficient. Public opinion has become a currency of its own. Rockefeller nodded. He had built his empire in an age when business could operate behind closed doors, when Standard Oil's machinations, the rebates, the drawbacks, the ruthless acquisition of competitors remained largely unknown to ordinary Americans. That era had ended with Ida Tarbell's exposés and the subsequent antitrust prosecution. The modern age demanded a new approach. Arrange it, he said simply. 3 months later, Rockefeller stood on the first tee at Pocantico Hill's private golf course, aware of the photographer Lee had positioned at a discreet distance. The early morning light flattered his features, softening the gaunt angles of age into something more grandfatherly. He wore a dark suit despite the game, his concession to informality limited to removing his jacket. William Harkness, son of his early Standard Oil partner Stephen Harkness, stood nearby with a caddy. Their weekly game had become part of Rockefeller's carefully structured routine, a tableau of normalcy that Lee insisted had value beyond exercise. Beautiful morning, John, Harkness observed, watching Rockefeller address the ball. The Lord provides, Rockefeller replied, his swing measured and precise. The ball sailed in a gentle arc, landing squarely in the fairway, a demonstration of the control he had maintained throughout his life. He permitted himself a small smile, aware the camera had captured it. The smile itself was strategic, a softening of the stern visage Americans had come to associate with Standard Oil. As they walked down the fairway, Rockefeller spotted a groundskeeper's child watching from behind a hedge of rhododendrons. He paused, reaching into his pocket for a shiny dime. "Young man," he called, gesturing the boy forward, "do you know the value of thrift?" The child approached cautiously, no more than 8 years old, his clothes clean but worn. "No, sir," the boy replied, eyes fixed on the gleaming coin between Rockefeller's fingers. "If you save this dime, and another each week, by the time you reach my age, you might be as fortunate as I have been." Rockefeller placed the coin in the boy's palm, aware that Lee's photographer had captured the moment. But remember to give back a portion of what you earn. That is as important as the earning itself." The child nodded solemnly, clutching the dime. Rockefeller knew the photographer would develop the images that afternoon. Within days, newspapers across America would carry the photo, a humanizing glimpse of the world's richest man sharing wisdom and modest wealth with a child of modest means. The irony that his actual giving now operated on a scale of millions rather than dimes was part of the strategy. The small gesture made the large ones more digestible. "You see, William," Rockefeller said as they continued their round, "our family meetings each week emphasize 3 principles: earn, save, give. I believe in building a dynasty not merely of wealth but of contribution." "Junior seems to have taken that to heart," Harkness replied. "His handling of Colorado shows remarkable resilience." Rockefeller nodded, thinking of his son's transformation. The Colorado crisis had forced John Jr. from the shadow of financial management into the glaring light of public scrutiny. The experience had hardened something in him while softening other edges. He had toured the mining camps personally, shaking calloused hands, listening to grievances, promising reforms in working conditions. "He understands what I have always known," Rockefeller said. "Our wealth creates obligation, not merely to give, but to give systematically, to build institutions that outlast individual lives." The weekly family meeting at 4 West 54th Street brought together 3 generations of Rockefellers. John sat at the head of the table, John Jr. to his right. The grandchildren, including young Nelson, who showed particular interest in these gatherings, listened as financial reports were presented, charitable allocations discussed, and family values reinforced. "The foundation has allocated $3 million for hookworm eradication in the American South," Junior reported. "The initial results are promising. Children who could barely attend school are showing marked improvement." Rockefeller nodded approvingly. This was philanthropy as he envisioned it, scientific, measurable, attacking root causes rather than symptoms. The structure of his giving had evolved from personal donations to Baptist causes toward institutional approaches that applied business principles to social problems. "And the Institute's research on infectious disease?" he asked. "Advancing steadily," Junior replied. "Dr. Flexner believes we may see breakthroughs in several areas within the decade." The family structure mirrored the institutional 1 weekly meetings, clear reporting lines, reinvestment of resources. John Jr. had married Abby Aldrich, daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich, in 1901, creating a marriage of industrial wealth and political influence that remained discreet but significant. The senator had helped architect the Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, a reform that aligned with Rockefeller's preference for stability and predictable systems. After the meeting concluded, Rockefeller remained with his son. The others filed out, leaving father and son in the wood-paneled study where portraits of Baptist ministers shared wall space with maps of Standard Oil's former empire, now fractured into 34 separate companies by the Supreme Court's 1911 antitrust decision. "Ivy Lee reports the public perception is shifting," Junior said. "The dime stories have taken hold. People are beginning to separate the man from the monopoly." "And what of Ludlow?" the elder Rockefeller asked, his voice level. "The reforms are being implemented. Better housing, grievance procedures, recognition of certain worker representatives. Not a union as they demanded, but a company structure that acknowledges their concerns." Rockefeller nodded. He had remained largely silent on Ludlow, allowing Junior to navigate those waters. The massacre had occurred on the son's watch, and the father believed in accountability. Yet he had also calculated that his own intervention might only inflame sentiment against the family. Better to let Junior demonstrate a new Rockefeller approach to labor, while the patriarch focused on philanthropy's larger canvas. "The tax filings are complete," Junior added. "Between the foundation, the institute, and the board, the deductions are substantial but entirely lawful." "I would expect nothing less," Rockefeller replied. "I have always insisted on paying every cent the law requires, no more, no less." The room fell silent for a moment, both men contemplating the transformation of their world. The federal income tax, The antitrust breakup of Standard Oil, the growing labor movement, the war in Europe, the pillars of the 19th century were crumbling, and a new order was taking shape. "Do you regret any of it?" Junior asked suddenly, a question he rarely dared pose. Rockefeller considered carefully, his gaze moving to the window where gaslight gave way to electric illumination along Fifth Avenue. "I regret that men died in Colorado," he said finally. "I regret when any enterprise associated with our name causes suffering rather than prosperity. But the work itself, building standard, organizing chaos into order, creating wealth that now funds science and education, no, I do not regret that." He turned back to his son, the heir to both his fortune and its complexities. "The world changes, Junior. We must adapt while holding to principles. The dimes and the photographs, these are adaptations. The charitable trusts and foundations, these are principles. One acknowledges the court of public opinion, the other builds for eternity." Outside, automobile headlamps cut through gathering dusk, symbols of the new century powered by Standard's fractured empire. The wealth that had made Rockefeller the world's richest man continued to grow, paradoxically increased by the very breakup meant to diminish it. The shares of the separated companies had multiplied in value as automobiles replaced horses and petroleum became civilization's lifeblood. Yet, as his wealth expanded, Rockefeller's physical presence in the business world contracted. He spent more time at Pocantico Hills, walking its manicured paths, playing golf, receiving carefully selected visitors. His inner circle narrowed to family, to Gates, to a handful of advisors who managed the complex web of personal holdings, family trusts, and institutional endowments that constituted the Rockefeller footprint. The grandfather clock chimed 9. Junior rose to leave, the weight of Colorado and corporate reorganization visible in his posture. Rockefeller remained seated, his thin fingers tracing the edge of a financial statement. Tomorrow would bring another carefully orchestrated appearance, another photograph of the smiling patriarch, another dime pressed into a child's palm, small symbols of a vast invisible empire reconfiguring itself for a new age. As Junior reached the door, Rockefeller spoke once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "Remember, son, our name will outlast our fortune, and our institutions will outlast our name. Build accordingly." The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of John D. Rockefeller's study at Pocantico Hills, casting long golden rectangles across the polished oak floor. Outside, autumn was painting the Hudson Valley in amber and scarlet. But inside, the world's richest man sat in relative simplicity, reviewing financial statements with the same meticulous attention he'd given them for 6 decades. At 79, Rockefeller remained remarkably spry. His frame had grown more slender with the years, his face more deeply lined, but the clear blue eyes retained their penetrating quality. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored but not ostentatious, with a plain gold watch chain crossing his vest. "Frederick," he said, looking up as his trusted advisor Frederick Gates entered the room, "these foundation disbursements for the Hookworm campaign. 500,000 souls treated in the South. A remarkable achievement." Gates, a former Baptist minister whose organizational brilliance had transformed Rockefeller's philanthropy from personal charity to institutional force, nodded with measured satisfaction. "The Sanitary Commission's work has exceeded our projections, sir. The economic impact is already measurable in certain counties, school attendance up nearly 30%, agricultural productivity improving." Rockefeller steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "I visited Spelman College last spring. Do you know what I saw, Frederick? Young women, Negro women, studying chemistry and biology with the same textbooks used at Vassar." A slight smile crossed his face. "When I was a boy, such a thing would have been unimaginable." Gates took a seat across from his employer. Both men knew that their General Education Board had channeled nearly $180 million into American education, with substantial sums directed toward institutions. Like Tuskegee, Hampton, and Spelman, the industrial education model has its critics, Gates noted carefully. Mr. Du Bois has made his objections quite clear, Rockefeller acknowledged, referring to the Harvard-educated black intellectual who advocated for more classical education. But I believe Mr. Washington's approach offers immediate pathways to economic stability. We are building systems, Frederick, not creating dependencies. The conversation paused as Rockefeller's manservant brought in a silver tea service. Outside, the rumble of an automobile announced the arrival of his son, John Jr. The foundation board meeting is tomorrow, Gates continued after the servant departed. The yellow fever team in Guayaquil is reporting significant progress. Dr. Noguchi believes he's isolated the causative agent. And what of the war situation? Rockefeller asked quietly. Although America had only recently entered the European conflict, the ramifications were already being felt throughout his philanthropic enterprises. Our medical researchers are being consulted by the War Department, Gates replied. The Institute's work on wound antisepsis may save thousands of lives at the front. The door opened and John D. Rockefeller Jr. entered, removing his driving gloves. At 43, Jr. had grown into his role as the family's public face, more comfortable with journalists and politicians than his father had ever been. The film crew was packed up, Jr. announced. I believe they got what they needed. Rockefeller nodded. The silent film interview conducted earlier that day had been carefully orchestrated by Ivy Lee, the public relations counsel hired after the Ludlow tragedy. In it, Rockefeller had spoken directly to the camera, defending Standard Oil's legacy of efficiency and integration. The interview would be distributed to schools and civic organizations across America. Did I appear too formal? The elder Rockefeller asked his son. You appeared as you are, father, dignified and forthright. Junior sat down, accepting a cup of tea. The public's perception continues to soften. Few remember the octopus. They see only the benefactor. They see what they wish to see, Rockefeller replied, a trace of irony in his voice. The same man who built Standard Oil now dismantles disease and ignorance. I find it curious that my motives are considered purer now, when the sums involved are so much larger. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the estate, Rockefeller took his customary stroll through the gardens. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, mingled with wood smoke from distant chimneys. His personal physician, Dr. Hamilton Bigger, walked at his side, monitoring his pace. Your pulse remains steady at 68, Dr. Bigger noted. Most men half your age would envy such numbers. God's grace and a simple diet, Rockefeller replied. Perhaps also the satisfaction of seeing one's work bear fruit. They paused at a stone bench overlooking the valley. Below, lights were beginning to twinkle in the neighboring villages. Rockefeller sat, drawing a smooth river stone from his pocket, a habit he'd developed years ago, finding that the tactile sensation calmed his thoughts. I received word today that our hookworm treatments in North Carolina have reduced infection rates by 70%, he said. A child who doesn't carry parasites can attend school, learn a trade, build a future. You've transformed public health in the South, Dr. Bigger observed. Not I, Rockefeller corrected gently. The foundation, the commission, the doctors and nurses who administer the treatments. The system endures beyond any individual. As they resumed walking, Rockefeller's thoughts turned to the recent investment reports. Despite giving away more than half his annual income to philanthropy, his wealth had reached staggering heights. Conservative estimates placed it at the equivalent of over $300 billion in contemporary terms, a number so vast it had become abstract. I intend to increase the Foundation's funding for medical research next year, he told Dr. Bigger. This influenza epidemic underscores how vulnerable we remain to disease. We must build the scientific infrastructure for the next generation of treatments. The physician nodded. Your institutes are already at the forefront. The work on antibacterial compounds shows promise. Back at the main house, Rockefeller found Starr Murphy, his legal advisor, waiting with a stack of documents requiring signature. Most pertained to educational endowments and research grants. The Rockefeller Institute's budget for next year, Murphy explained, sliding one document forward. Dr. Flexner has outlined 3 new research initiatives. including continued work on what they're calling antibiotics compounds. Rockefeller signed with a steady hand. Tell Abraham that results matter more than methods. I want practical treatments, not merely academic papers. Murphy gathered the signed documents. There's increasing pressure for you to comment on the income tax situation. Your adjusted rate last year approached 50%. I will pay every cent the law requires, Rockefeller replied evenly. Those who built this country through enterprise should support it through taxation. Make it known that I consider wealth a trust, not a personal possession. That night, as the household settled into silence, Rockefeller sat in his modest bedroom, reading his Bible by lamplight. The passage was from Luke, concerning the proper stewardship of resources. He reflected on how different his life had become from the ambitious young refiner who had built Standard Oil from nothing. His mind drifted to a conversation he'd had with Junior earlier that day about investment strategy. The foundation requires stability, he'd explained. Move more assets into government bonds and high-grade corporate paper. Keep enough in standard successor companies for dividend flow, but prioritize safety over growth. Junior had nodded, making notes. Your philosophy remains consistent. We're building for generations, not quarters. I won't be here to see the full harvest, Rockefeller had replied matter-of-factly, but I intend to leave the fields well tended. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reading. It was his secretary with a telegram from the Foundation's yellow fever team in Ecuador. Treatment protocols producing significant reduction in mortality. Stop requesting additional funding for expanded field operations. Stop, the message read. Rockefeller scribbled a brief approval on the telegram's margin. Yellow fever had plagued humanity for centuries. Now it was retreating before systematic, scientific assault. The pattern was the same one he'd applied to business: identify the problem, deploy resources efficiently, measure results, adjust methods based on evidence. Spring 1919 found Rockefeller in his cottage at Ormond Beach, Florida, where he spent winters away from the northern cold. The war had ended months earlier, but a different enemy had emerged: the Spanish influenza pandemic that claimed more American lives than the conflict itself. Gates had arrived the previous day with reports from the Rockefeller Institute, where researchers were studying the disease's transmission patterns. Our scientists believe it's viral, not bacterial, Gates explained as they sat on the veranda overlooking the Atlantic, which complicates treatment options considerably. Rockefeller listened attentively. And vaccination? Early stages. The Foundation has approved emergency grants to 5 research hospitals. Dr. Cole believes we're laying groundwork that will benefit future generations, even if immediate solutions prove elusive. The conversation shifted to the Foundation's expanding global footprint: medical schools in China, public health initiatives in Brazil, research partnerships across Europe. We're creating a worldwide network, Gates said with quiet pride. Knowledge flows across borders even when politics intrudes. Rockefeller nodded. The model remains constant: build systems, train professionals, establish standards, measure outcomes. The same principles that built Standard Oil can dismantle disease and ignorance. Later that afternoon, Rockefeller played 9 holes of golf, a routine he maintained well into his 70s. His playing partner was a visiting professor from the University of Chicago, an institution Rockefeller had helped establish with transformative donations. Your endowment has enabled research that would otherwise be impossible, the professor remarked as they walked between holes. We've attracted scientists from across Europe, fleeing the chaos after the war. The university must remain independent, Rockefeller replied. My funds come without ideological strings. Truth emerges from inquiry, not doctrine. By 1920, prohibition had transformed American social life. Speakeasies flourished in urban centers. Bootleggers found profitable new trade routes. The Roaring Twenties were beginning their exuberant ascent. Rockefeller, a lifelong teetotaler, watched these developments with mixed emotions. Though he approved of temperance on moral grounds, the lawlessness that followed prohibition troubled him. We cannot legislate personal virtue, he remarked to Junior during a family dinner at Pocantico. The same lesson applies to our philanthropic work. People must be partners in their own improvement, not merely recipients of our largesse. Junior, who had taken a more active role in the Rockefeller Foundation's governance, nodded in agreement. That's why the Hookworm campaign included education as well as treatment. We taught hygiene and prevention alongside administering medication. The family discussion turned to their educational initiatives in the South. Spelman College, named for Rockefeller's wife's family, had become a leading institution for Negro women's education. The General Education Board continued to channel millions into schools across the region. There's criticism that our industrial education model is too conservative, Junior noted, that we're reinforcing existing social hierarchies rather than challenging them. Practical skills create economic independence, the elder Rockefeller responded. I started as a bookkeeper before I could dream of being an oil refiner. Each generation builds upon the last. That autumn, Rockefeller received a letter from a former Standard Oil employee who had fallen on hard times. The man requested financial assistance, recalling their association decades earlier. Rockefeller passed the letter to Gates with a note. Investigate his circumstances and current needs. If verified, arrange assistance through the appropriate foundation program, not as personal charity. This response typified his approach to giving, systematic, institutional, focused on long-term outcomes rather than temporary relief. The same man who had ruthlessly consolidated the oil industry now applied similar discipline to dismantling disease and expanding education. Individual charity often creates dependency, he explained to Gates. Institutional philanthropy creates opportunity. The first satisfies the giver, the second transforms the recipient. By 1923, as Rockefeller approached his 84th birthday, his daily routine had become ritual. He rose early, read his Bible, took breakfast, reviewed correspondence, napped briefly after lunch, then spent afternoons in moderate exercise. Golf when weather permitted, indoor activities when it didn't. His wealth, despite massive philanthropic outflows, remained staggering. The Standard Oil successor companies continued generating substantial dividends, though he had shifted much of his portfolio toward bonds and other stable instruments to fund his foundation's ongoing work. During a foundation board meeting that spring, a discussion arose about funding priorities for the coming decade. Medical research must remain paramount, Rockefeller stated firmly. The influenza pandemic demonstrated our vulnerability. We must build scientific capacity for challenges we cannot yet imagine. A younger board member raised the question of eugenics research, which had gained academic popularity. Several universities are requesting grants for studies in hereditary improvement. Rockefeller considered this carefully. Science must explore all avenues, but our focus remains practical health outcomes, not theoretical social engineering. Fund basic research, but prioritize treatments for existing diseases. Later, walking with Junior through Pocantico's gardens, Rockefeller reflected on the transformation of his public image. The newspapers that once called me an octopus now described me as a benefactor, he observed with a trace of irony. Yet I remain the same man, applying the same principles. Your methods created both outcomes, Junior replied thoughtfully. Consolidation in business eliminated inefficiency, but created monopoly. Consolidation in philanthropy eliminates duplication of effort and creates institutional strength. Rockefeller nodded, pleased by his son's insight. The goal has always been the same, to die having made the world better than I found it. To be remembered not for wealth accumulated, but for good accomplished. As twilight descended over the Hudson Valley estate, Rockefeller paused by a limestone balustrade overlooking the river. In the distance, New York City's skyline was transforming, taller buildings reaching higher into the clouds, new bridges spanning wider waters. America itself was changing, becoming urban, industrial, modern. He drew a smooth stone from his pocket, a habit maintained for decades, and turned it slowly in his palm. Like the stone, his fortune had been polished by time, its rough edges smoothed by purpose. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away, he murmured, quoting scripture as was his habit. But while the gift remains in our keeping, We bear responsibility for its use. The stones in his pocket felt cool against his fingers as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains of his bedroom at the casements. John D. Rockefeller, at 95, moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that time, like oil, flowed according to its own pressure. His ritual remained unchanged, awake before the sun, Bible open on his lap, the book of Proverbs under his magnifying glass. "The blessing of the Lord makes one rich, and he adds no sorrow with it," he read aloud, his voice a whisper in the quiet Florida room. Outside his window, Ormond Beach was still sleeping. The Atlantic breathed its rhythmic tide against the shore. His chauffeur wouldn't arrive for another hour. There was time for contemplation, for the accounting that had structured his life since he'd first opened Ledger A as a young man in Cleveland. His simple breakfast arrived precisely at 7 milk and crackers, nothing more. His doctor had prescribed this Spartan diet decades ago, and Rockefeller, ever disciplined, had followed it religiously. The serving girl was new, nervous in his presence. "Sir," she said, setting down the tray with trembling hands, "my grandfather says you gave him a dime when he was a boy." Rockefeller smiled. "Perhaps I did." His hand went to his pocket, where he kept a supply of fresh dimes alongside his smooth stones. "Here's one for you as well. The first dime I ever earned, I gave to the church. Remember that." The dime ritual had become his trademark in these twilight years, a minor extravagance from a man who lived modestly despite his immense wealth. His dark suits were well made but never ostentatious. The casements itself, while comfortable, was humble compared to the marble palaces built by his Gilded Age contemporaries. After breakfast came his drive, the chauffeur taking him along the same route every morning, down the beach road where the winter sunshine painted the water gold. The car moved slowly. At his age, Rockefeller saw no reason to hurry. He had outlived almost everyone from the great oil wars of the previous century. His enemies were gone. His victories were institutional now, etched in the corporate landscape of America. "To the golf course today, sir?" his chauffeur asked. "Indeed, Charles. 9 holes, as usual." At the course, they greeted him with deference. His golf game was slow, methodical, a careful placement of the ball, a measured swing. He no longer hit with power, but his putting remained precise. Calculation over force had always been his way. By noon, he returned to the casements for his scheduled 20-minute nap, no more, no less. An assistant stood by with a pocket watch. When Rockefeller closed his eyes, the decades seemed to blur together. Standard Oil's rise, the Supreme Court's dissolution order in 1911, the ironic multiplication of his wealth as the pieces of his empire, now Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, grew more valuable apart than together. When he woke, his son John Jr. was waiting in the study. "Father," Jr. said, rising from his chair. Now in his 60s, the younger Rockefeller had grown into his role as the family's public face. The foundation board meeting went well. The hookworm eradication program continues to show remarkable results. The elder Rockefeller nodded, pleased. The Rockefeller Foundation, with its endowment of hundreds of millions, had become his most enduring legacy, more permanent than even the oil empire. And the University of Chicago? Thriving. The physics department has attracted 3 brilliant European scientists fleeing the situation in Germany. Their conversation moved to financial matters, investments, dividends, the trust structures that would outlive them both. The Depression had ravaged America, but the Rockefeller fortune, diversified and carefully managed, had weathered the storm. He had issued statements supporting relief efforts, donated to unemployment funds, but mostly watched from a distance as Roosevelt's New Deal reshaped the nation. "The eugenics grants," Jr. said hesitantly. "We've begun redirecting those funds. The science is questionable, and the political implications troubling, particularly with what's happening in Germany." Rockefeller frowned slightly. The foundation had funded eugenics research in the 1920s, part of its commitment to scientific progress. Now, with Hitler's racial theories casting a shadow over such work, the ethical calculations had shifted. "Follow the science," he said simply. "If the research is unsound, withdraw support." As evening approached, Rockefeller retired to his desk, a simple wooden affair with only the essentials: his Bible, a ledger, an inkwell, and a magnifying glass. Conspicuously absent was a telephone. He had never placed one on his desk, preferring the discipline of paper and ink, the buffer that assistants provided against the world's demands. He fingered the smooth stones in his pocket, a habit he'd developed decades ago to manage stress. In moments of tension during boardroom battles or congressional inquiries, those stones had centered him, reminded him that patience and pressure, applied correctly, could wear down any obstacle. His dinner was plain soup, bread, a piece of fruit. No wine, no coffee. His abstemiousness had become legendary, as had his longevity. While contemporaries like Carnegie, Morgan, and Harriman had long since passed, Rockefeller endured, watching as the world transformed around him. That winter of 1936 into 1937 was mild by Florida standards. Each day followed its prescribed pattern: Bible at dawn, simple meals, golf, carriage rides, precisely timed rest. The routine was comfort, control, in a world growing increasingly chaotic. In Europe, war clouds gathered. In America, labor unrest continued despite the New Deal's reforms. On a clear April morning, as Rockefeller sat on the veranda watching the Atlantic, his personal physician joined him for their weekly checkup. "Your heart sounds strong for a man of 97, the doctor said, putting away his stethoscope, "though I'd recommend reducing your golf to perhaps twice weekly." Rockefeller smiled faintly. "The Lord's work isn't finished with me yet, it seems." "You've outlived most of your contemporaries by decades, Mr. Rockefeller. I never aimed to outlive them, only to outlast them." It was one of his rare moments of candor about the business wars of the previous century. As spring deepened, Rockefeller found himself increasingly reflective. One evening, as his assistant helped him review some foundation correspondence, he paused at a letter from the University of Chicago, detailing a breakthrough in cancer research funded by his endowment. "When I began," he said quietly, "I never imagined this would be the outcome. Oil barrels to microscopes." "Sir?" "Nothing." He signed the letter with his careful hand. "Ensure this research receives whatever additional funding it requires." On May 22, 1937, Rockefeller retired as usual after his simple dinner. The windows of the casements were open to the spring breeze. His Bible lay open beside his bed. His stones rested on the nightstand, smooth from decades of handling. His ledger was closed, its columns balanced to the penny as they had been since he was a bookkeeper's apprentice in Cleveland. He died peacefully in his sleep that night, just short of his 98th birthday. The news traveled by telephone and telegram, then splashed across newspaper headlines worldwide. Obituary writers struggled to capture the man who had built Standard Oil and then given away over $540 million, a fortune within a fortune. The New York Times devoted 20 columns to his life, attempting to balance founder of Standard Oil with history's greatest philanthropist. His funeral was small, private, and Baptist, as he would have wanted. He was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, near his wife Settie, who had preceded him by 22 years. But the true measure of John D. Rockefeller wouldn't be found in his modest grave. It lived in the institutions he had built and funded. The University of Chicago with its growing collection of Nobel laureates, Rockefeller University with its medical breakthroughs, the Rockefeller Foundation with its global health initiatives that would later help spark the Green Revolution. It lived too in the corporate descendants of Standard Oil, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron giants that powered America's industrial might through the remainder of the century. The 1911 breakup, intended as punishment, had ultimately multiplied his legacy. His desk at the casements was preserved as he left it: Bible, ledger, inkwell, magnifying glass, and smooth stones, but no telephone. It was the workspace of a man from another time, when business moved at the speed of paper and ink, when fortunes were built on pennies saved and commodities controlled. In the decades that followed his death, scholars would debate his methods and motives. Was he the ruthless monopolist depicted by Ida Tarbell, or the business genius who had brought order to a chaotic industry? Was his philanthropy genuine charity or calculated image repair? The 1882 Trust Agreement and the 1911 Supreme Court decision became studied texts in business and law schools. The Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, preserved his papers for researchers seeking answers. Even his simple habit of carrying smooth stones became the stuff of business folklore, the titan who managed stress by keeping tangible reminders of patience and persistence in his pocket. The century turned. Oil, the commodity that built his fortune, transformed the planet, powering its vehicles, heating its homes, forming its plastics, while simultaneously threatening its climate. The Rockefeller Foundation, adapting to new challenges, shifted some investments away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy, an ironic twist in the family legacy. The lessons of his business life: control the bottlenecks, own the scarce inputs, buy in panics, delegate and measure, tithe early, shape the regulations you must follow, became business school axioms. His careful, controlled approach to wealth, viewing money as a trust to be administered rather than consumed, influenced generations of philanthropists. And the smooth stones, the simple diet, the measured naps, the daily accounting, these too were part of his legacy, reminders that empires are built not through grand gestures but through discipline applied daily, through attention to the smallest details, through the compound interest of habit. In the end, perhaps his greatest skill had been patience, the willingness to plant trees whose shade he would never sit beneath, to build institutions that would outlast not just his competitors, but the very era that produced them. He had turned temporary advantage into permanent structure, converted industrial wealth into intellectual and social capital. The boy who had recorded his first earnings in Ledger A had become the man whose philanthropic accounting would fill volumes. The oil that had made him rich would power the century he barely glimpsed, and the institutions he endowed would continue their work long after the last person who had received one of his dimes had spent it. He built more than a company. He built the foundations of modern capitalism. John D. Rockefeller showed that wealth, when guided by discipline and purpose, could move nations. He proved that order could conquer chaos, and that one man's vision could fuel an entire world. But his empire came with questions that still echo today. How much control is too much, and how much is enough? He was praised as a philanthropist, feared as a monopolist, and remembered as both saint and shark. In the end, Rockefeller's greatest legacy was not just his fortune, but the idea that ambition must serve a higher purpose. A century later, his name still defines power, precision, and perseverance. His story reminds us that success without conscience is hollow, but discipline with vision can change the world. Thank you for watching Richie Rich Stories. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and leave a comment about what you think of John D. Rockefeller and his legacy. Let the world know your thoughts, and keep the conversation about true wealth alive.